sorry about the delay, guys. Having a bit of issues. Wraith, I would give that a refresh. Things have been a little weird on my end too. Yeah, I'm only seeing mods and a couple of people. Don't know what's going on. Sorry, I just put in eye drops. So, yeah, Twitch has been, well, twitchy. So, things have been a little weird. I found out what was going on with Frosty Tools, which is why you're seeing Frosty Tools as itself. I basically had to reconnect, or disconnect and reconnect Frosty Tools from my account due to issues with Twitch itself that have happened within the last 4 days, which I was not aware of. So I just found out what was going on, so I had to deal with that. So yeah, minor delay, so apologies. Yes, pun is absolutely intended. Absolutely intended. Hold on, let me get my fuzzy blanket. For those who have not seen this, this is my new chair blanket. It's purple, and it's fuzzy, and it's really, really warm. It's my new best friend when it comes to sitting here at the computer, because I am forever cold. So, yes, pun is absolutely intended, with Twitch being twitchy. Okay. What is going on? There we go. Sorry. Oh my goodness. Yeah. So things have been a little, chaotic here. Alright. Yeah, so I'm letting my eye drops settle in, and apparently fixing Frosty Tools as stream is starting. So, fun times. For anybody who might be new, I am Meshla, and I primarily stream. Sorry, give me 1 second. I primarily stream fanfiction readings. That's my thing. You'll also see me occasionally playing SWTOR. I was supposed to play SWTOR this evening, but I actually switched it to Monday. This Monday this week, because I wanted to read on Christmas, because I felt that was more appropriate for Christmas Day. So yeah. So just bear with me a minute or two, or 5, while I get this sorted. Still dealing with some minor technical issues that, yeah. It's been a nice, quiet day for me, which is good. I hope everybody has had a relaxing day and has been able to spend time with family. That's really important this time of year. And if you have not been able to spend time with family for whatever reason, please know that I'm thinking of you and wishing you all the best. So just give me a minute here while I get things sorted. And do let me know if the music is a little bit too loud. I was trying to get it working. Hey Benji, Merry Christmas. Good to see you. I was just letting chat know that things have been a little chaotic over here. Frosty Tools kind of broke. So, yeah. Oh my goodness, stop. 20 million things open in my browser, of course. 20 million things. Okay, chapter. Okay. Oh goodness. Yeah. It's been a little crazy. It's been a bit of an evening as far as tech issues go with stream. Yes. Okay, I should have everything ready to go now. Wraith, if you could do me a favor and try giving Benji a shout out. I think Frosty Tools is working now. It should be. Just if you could give me a try for that, that would be amazing. Yay, it worked! Awesome! It worked. That makes me happy. Okay. Yeah, so apparently Twitch and Frosty Tools were not communicating with each other, and stuff was kind of broken on Twitch's end of things, but it appears to have been fixed. So keep your fingers crossed, or whatever it is you do for that kind of stuff. Yeah. Alright. I'm still getting levels sorted, sorry guys. Trying not to blast my own eardrums, but keep it loud enough so that you guys can hear it. So let me know. Okay. Alrighty. Alright. No cocoa for me this evening. I actually had some earlier. Cocoa is one of my favorite things about this time of year. So yeah, had some earlier. Alright. Again, I do apologize for the delay. Was dealing with some technical issues, but here we are. We're going to be starting with chapter 26 this evening. As we finished off chapter 25 last Wednesday. So we'll see how far we get this evening. My goal is to get to chapter 30. We'll see how I'm feeling. I may actually go till 10 o'clock this evening. Hopefully you guys can hang around for that. We'll see how far we get. We might even get to the end of the story. We'll find out. Just as a heads up, if we do, there are a couple of kind of deleted scenes that didn't really fit anywhere else in the story. So they're kind of tacked on at the end. So if we get that far, just keep that in mind. I think it's chapters 32 and 33. So let's see where we get. Alright. I was going to do Christmas music this evening, but Spotify was being weird and didn't want to cooperate with me, so we are with my normal lo-fi this evening. Alright. Okay. And for anybody who might be new, welcome in. I hope you've had an awesome Christmas, and I hope you enjoy the stream. We're going to be reading some fanfiction this evening. Okay. Give me just 2 seconds while I check something. Oh goodness, so sorry. Okay, there we go. post No, but there are some deleted scenes. It's not really a post credits gag reel. It's just some extra scenes that didn't really fit anywhere else in the story due to timeline and what they were. So if we get that far, just keep that in mind. Okay. I think I'm good now, except for maybe my glasses. Okay. Alrighty. We're gonna move this over here. No. Leave it where it was. I'm moving things, so don't mind me. Alright. Chapter 26. Anyway, I'm just gonna drop this in the chat before I start reading. If you guys want to have some ambience. I do also have music going, so maybe that would be a little much. I'm not sure. But yeah. Chapter 26. Marin watched the scanner readout in her HUD with one eye, keeping her grip firm on the flight controls. With her right hand, she punched in the coordinates for home. She then waited a few moments before kicking the sublights to full and pulling away from Ethan and Dylan. She wouldn't be landing at the house. They'd know to check there. She had tuned out Ethan minutes ago as she evaded him yet again. Finally, she reached the edge of the Catan system and pressed the commit key on the navcomp, sending the Tricinia hurtling into hyperspace. In the back of her mind, she knew that it wouldn't be long. She had to do something about that tracking device. She closed her eyes, reaching out to where she knew the device was attached to the hull. She'd done this with locks before, but tracking beacons were different. Beads of sweat stood out on her forehead as she traced the wiring and the force until she found the proper connection, and severed it. There was a faint pulse, and then the security panel fell silent. It wouldn't stop them for long, but it would at least slow them down. She opened her eyes and stood, returning to her quarters to grab more power packs for the DE-10s. With that done, she sank back into the pilot's chair, idly playing with her knives for a moment before she began to sharpen them. "What the?" Dylan said as he looked over his scanners on the customized XJ's right panel. "I've lost her tracking signal." "Is she out of range?" Ethan asked from the D5 Mantis. "No, I should be able to detect her from at least half a dozen systems away on the scanners," the young Jedi told him. "She must have found a way to shut it off." "Can you send me the coordinates?" Andrea asked from her father's computer in the study. "Sending the course she took," Dylan said as he aimed the nose of the XJ-3 down her flight path and transmitted the course heading. "That takes her to the Tanagas system," Andrea's voice returned a few moments later. "Our Chuck," Dylan cursed in Mandoa. "She's heading for home. Then that's where I'm heading too." "Give me the navcom heading," Dylan said as he started warming up the hyperdrive. "I'm going with you." Marin's head rose as she felt a warning tingle. "They're following." She cursed silently and closed down even tighter. Should have known it wouldn't be that easy. She could feel the anger welling up inside her again. Why can't they just leave me alone? Carefully, she slipped her knives back into their sheaths, including the one in her boot. The control board pinged. The Tricinia was coming up on the Tanaga system. She watched the countdown, pulling the lever to drop her back into real space. She'd have to be quick. She needed to find where Tricinia had been last. Her frown deepened. It was going to be close. She knew that much. Her fingers closed firmly over the flight controls as she guided the Tricinia through the atmosphere, bypassing the hangar entirely. They would most likely check there first. She kept low, only a few hundred meters above the forest canopy until she carefully lowered the ship into a clearing several kilometers from the house. Ethan and Dylan entered the system, and Ethan immediately began to head for the hangar, with Dylan following close behind. The young Jedi had hoped that the signal from the tracking beacon would return once he got into the system, but he knew it was a foolish hope as he checked his scanners and saw nothing. "Which planet is it?" he asked Dylan on the Mando's chosen channel. "Outer planet's forest moon," Ethan said. "I'm keeping the location of the house to myself. It's the least I can do for Jarius at this point. Go down into the atmosphere and start doing some close-range scans. I doubt she would have gone straight to the house, but I'll check anyway. Copy that, Dylan said as he nosed the black XJ3 down and had the astromech start scanning the forest floor below. The sensor board pinged again, causing Marin to study her HUD feed closely. 2 ships had just dropped out of hyperspace and were heading straight for the moon. And fast. She knew Ethan's D5 Mantis. The XJ3 could only be Dylan. With a curse, she punched in a command to the Navicomp and began scanning the database. 2 minutes later, she had her answer. The outer Katani colony world of Galan. It would only take a few hours to get there. If she blasted off now, they know where she was. Frankly, she didn't really care at this point. Her shattered heart demanded vengeance. Carefully, she began to bring the repulsors out of standby. Viper beeped once, and Dylan read the message on his scanners, as his scanner started to pick it up. Ethan, I've got her. Powering up her repulsor lifts. She's preparing to take off again. I'm on my way. Keep her pinned if you can, by any means, Dylan. Dylan took that the only way he could in this situation. He reached up to flip a switch as he did a split S and came around, heading towards the signal. As the XJ leveled out, the S-foil split to give the fighter the shape that's what was its namesake. I can't read. Good grief. I need water, apparently. My voice is still a little scuffed. Sorry. Marin felt the warning tingle again just before the sensor board picked up the XJ, closing fast. She swore, punching the shields to full as she engaged the repulsors, feeling the Tricina surge upwards. A thought began to form in her mind. She didn't have the control over the force that Dylan did, but she could at least slow him down. As she cleared the forest canopy, she kept in the sublights to half. She wanted him to catch up if this was going to work. Dylan saw that he was slowly gaining ground on Tricina and felt a slight nudge in the force warning him. What would she try to pull to keep him off of her? Viper, he asked the R7 snuggled in the slot behind him. I didn't look, but what are we loaded with? Proton torpedoes on port and starboard tubes, Viper answered immediately. Send your tube loaded with shadow bombs. Dylan nodded as he set his weapons to stutter fire his lasers. The torpedo loading was standard on the X-Wing, but they would be overkill on his mission profile, especially the shadow bombs. All right, Marin, he whispered as he kept track of her ship on the HUD. Come on and head back for the Praxium. I can outmaneuver, outrun, and outgun you. There is no use in this chase. Marin was watching her own HUD closely. He was almost on top of her. Gritting her teeth, she waited a few moments longer until he was almost directly above her. And then she moved. Her fingers stabbed towards the repulsor lift controls. They were still close enough to the ground that it should work. Sorry, I did put eye drops in, I swear. The repulsors kicked in, pushing the Tricina upwards, and her shields collided with those of the X-Wing. Marin watched, a satisfied grin crossing her face as she saw the small craft wobble and watched the interference between the 2 sets of shields before she pulled clear. What the? Dylan shouted as he felt the XJ3 bump around and pulled back on the stick to give some distance above Marin's ship. But he saw the YT-1930 gain a little bit of space ahead of him from the tactic. Viper, how bad are we hurt? The initializing circuits for the dorsal shield generator shorted from the impact, he saw on the interface. It will take a few moments to reset the systems and regain the shields. Dylan gritted his teeth at the move, but nodded slightly at the tactic. Jarius' ship, naturally, would have stronger shields than the XJ3 more than likely, and would have fared the collision better than the fighter would have. So that's the tune's name, is it? He said as he checked his lasers and brought the crosshairs as close to the freighter as he dared. Then let's see if you can pay the band. He pulled the trigger and saw the blue laser stutter towards the ship, coming close enough that Dylan was sure he'd scorched some of the paint with his shots. Marin's danger sense screamed. She rolled to port away from the shots, but she wasn't fast enough. The Tricina shook and her grip on the flight controls tightened as she leveled off again. She looked to the left, bringing up the firing controls for the quads. Powering them up, she zeroed in on Dylan's X-Wing, ensuring her shot went just a little wide. She was trying to warn him off. She squeezed off a shot, and it passed mere inches from his canopy. Sons of the Sith, Dylan muttered as he dropped the X-Wing underneath the Tracinia's flight path. He pitched the ship up again, just enough, and started to stutter fire again, right in front of her. Where the hell are you? He heard Dylan ask over their shared channel. Look for the laser fire and see for yourself, Dylan responded as he kept track of Merrin. Merrin swore, yanking hard on the flight controls as she rolled to starboard, opening up with the quads again. She could feel sweat trickling down her neck as she momentarily let the crosshairs settle on the ship before she nudged her aim, so it just barely missed. He felt the shot coming, and he stood the XJ up on its thrusters and then side-slipped upwards. This lifted the X-Wing above her shots before he fired a pair of low-powered shots of his own in Tracinia's aft shields to give her something to think about. Firefick, Merrin breathed as she felt his shots connect, jolting her forward against her crash webbing. She was seething now, snapping the Tracinia up on her side as if she were an X-Wing or a Nighthawk. She pulled around to follow him. The X-Wing was fast, and she had difficulty keeping him in her sights for long. Dylan switched channels as he kept weaving around to avoid her shots. He was staying out of her firing arc as much as he could, but keeping his weapons on her ship nearly constantly. Okay, he told her on an open channel. So far, I've only used stutter fire. It's not much against your shields, but you land or head back to Catan now, or I start switching to dual or quad fire. Merrin ignored him, rolling free of his target lock again as she tried to open the distance. He shook his head as he cut the channel and thought about his options. Shields restored, Viper announced, giving Dylan a plan of attack. Put rear shields to full power and put everything else into acceleration, Dylan told the droid as he suddenly firewalled the throttle. The XJ shot forward with all the speed the astromech could put into the engines and quickly overshot Tracinia. Dylan waited until he was far from Merrin and switched his lasers to quad fire. He knew it would set his lasers to fire simultaneously and at full power. Viper, he said as he timed it right. Shift everything to forward shields on my mark. Acknowledged. Standing by. 3, 2, 1, mark! Dylan pulled a quick smuggler's reverse as Viper threw everything into the shields to cover the fighter's point. He popped a snapshot with all 4 lasers that went just underneath Tracinia's bow and barely missed the ship. Merrin swore, pulling back sharply on the flight controls as a warning alarm sounded in her helmet. She snapped a shot towards him, not even checking to see if it connected before she rolled clear. Dylan barely noticed the hits to his shields, rotating the fighter around as she flew over him and pressed on after her. Viper evened the shields, and Dylan switched back to stutter fire, popping off shots in different directions, each time coming closer to her ship. A few moments later, Ethan joined up behind them, both, and started to see what he could do to make any difference in this or not. Merrin was the most stubborn he'd ever seen her. She saw the D5 Mantis on her scanners and swore again. Ethan's ship was designed for this type of thing. After a slow breath and a few side slips, she pushed the sublights to full as she pulled toward the atmosphere. She's going to make for hyperspace again, Dylan said as he looked at his system readouts. She hits hyperspace and again I won't be able to follow. I'm almost to the point where I need to head back or I'll get stuck here. Well, I can keep up with her for a while, Ethan said as he started to bracket the YT-1930 in his crosshairs. Dylan looked over to the Tracinia and noticed a shadow starting to form over the ship, and it was growing larger by the moment. It surprised him, and he looked up to see. Dear lady. Stefan brought Blue Talon in its flight mode over the 3 ships, ensuring the mobile suit's shadow completely covered the 1930 and that it got Merrin's attention. Dylan, brake for home, you're almost out of fuel, he said calmly over the channel as he came in low over top of Tracinia. Ethan, hang back and be ready to land on my signal. You got it, Ethan said as he pulled back in the Werda. On the way out, Dylan said as he pulled the XJ3 off target and made it... On the way out, Dylan said as he pulled the XJ3 off course and made toward space in a hyperspace vector for home. Merrin began to notice something strange. A large shadow was forming on the trees below and falling over the Tracina. She glanced at her sensor board and out the cockpit viewport, swearing. What in the Manda is that thing? She whispered to herself, the sight sending chills down her spine. Stefan kept Lou Talon over the Tracina, keeping her from leaving the atmosphere as he opened a channel. Marin, he told her in a calm, even voice, will you listen to me? Marin sat there, her gaze locked on the mobile suit through the cockpit armor plast. Her hands shook badly as she reached for the comm panel to her left. Mako Bonnie, she asked bluntly, but her voice trembled slightly. I want you to turn Tracina around, he told her softly. Take her into the hangar and wait for Ethan and I, okay? And I'm actually going to stop right there because we have an ad starting in about 5 seconds. So, that means I can get some water. Thanks, Wraith. I have been slouching just a little. I've also been messing around under my desk again with cables. My neck doesn't like it when I do that. Okay. Alrighty. Alright, break is gonna end in about 1 minute and 25 seconds. Like I said, I do try really hard to not read during the ad breaks. It's 1.5 minutes every time. Unfortunately, I have no control over the fact that we have them, so that is a great time to take an ad break, or take a water break, go have a stretch, things like that. And I'm actually going to check some settings in Frosty Tools. Give me a second. Alright, looks like we're back from our ad. I'm just double checking some settings on Frosty Tools. I'm just double checking some stuff real quick. Give me a second. Sorry, I was double checking some things. Okay. Marin's first thought was to refuse, but then her gaze drifted upwards again. Whatever that thing was, she knew she couldn't possibly outrun both of them. She choked back a sob of frustration and anger as she slowly pulled away from the giant craft and towards the D5 Mantis. Her hands shook as she hesitated momentarily before killing power to the quads. The Tracinia's speed slowed as she complied, orienting the 1930s nose toward the house. When she reached it, she cut power to the shield and input the passcode Jairus had taught her years ago. After a few moments, the hangar entrance lay open and she carefully guided the Tracinia inside on repulsors. The ship settled to the permacrete with a gentle bump, coolant hissing as the engines powered down. Ethan pointed the D5 Mantis towards the hangar and slowly guided the ship inside. Stefan brought Blue Talon close, but had yet to land as there was no room for the mobile suit in its flight mode. Instead, he reached above him and flipped the controls over. Blue Talon slowly switched to the mobile suit mode, with its engines gently landing the craft on the ground outside the hangar. There was still some distance, so Stefan walked the suit close to the hangar before powering it down. Then opened the cockpit hatch and stepped out on the armored door. Looking down into the hangar as Ethan finished landing the D5 Mantis, he grabbed the zipline that emerged from the suit's armor panel and started riding it to the ground. In the cockpit, Marin sat still for a long moment, her hands shaking. Finally, she rose and slowly walked towards the Tracinia's boarding ramp. Stefan entered the hangar as Ethan exited the word starting towards the Tracinia. The elder Jedi could tell that Ethan was fuming. Thanks for that lurk, Ajo. Ethan, he started to say. Nish, the Mando interrupted him as he saw the boarding ramp start to lower. No emotion speech right now. You can chastise me later. As soon as he knew his head would clear, he jumped onto the ramp before it even finished lowering. Marin saw him coming. Shasa, she could feel his anger. She backed away from the hatch control, trying to put some distance between them. She'd never seen him so angry, and it scared her. Out of pure reflex, she reached for one of her knives. Drop that knife, Ethan yelled as he closed the distance at a sprint. Before she could even comply, he batted the blade away and heard it hit the bulkhead behind her and then the deck plates as he gripped her firmly by the shoulder plate and led her down the ramp into the hangar floor. Stefan shot him a warning glance, but he ignored it as he got her to the permacrete. As soon as Ethan got off the boarding ramp, he asked, Just what the frell were you thinking, taking us on this wild bantha chase? Marin struggled in his grip, sobbing as she looked away, though her helmet muffled the sound. She shook her head at him, trying to pull free of his grasp before she swung at him with a closed fist, aiming for his throat. Ethan saw it coming and out of reflex caught it in his other hand and held tight. Zalkika, he told her, holding her firmly with both hands. This is your only warning. The next time you swing at me with that intent, you best be ready to face the consequences of the fight you'll get. Off with your Boise. Now. Ethan, Stefan started to say again. Release her. I will not, Ethan began to say as he felt Stefan's firm hand on his wrist. Mando, the Jedi said firmly, she is weakened emotionally. You and I are the closest she has to a mentor or father. This is not what she needs. Release her. Now. Ethan reluctantly released his grip on Marin and returned to the boarding ramp. Stefan placed himself between them and kept his gaze on Ethan before looking to Marin. Marin, he told her softly, take off your helmet. Now, please. Marin looked sideways at Ethan, stumbling slightly when he released her rather abruptly. Her gaze slid back towards Master Card, and she just looked at him for a moment before she reached up with shaking hands to pop the seal on her helmet. She then pulled it off, revealing her face, the red, puffy eyes and the tear streaks across her cheeks. She wasn't sure what to expect from either of them, least of all Ethan. Stefan looked back towards Ethan and motioned for him to go up the ramp into Tracinia. He waited until Ethan was out of sight before turning and kneeling in front of Marin. He could see the obvious signs that she had been crying during the entire ordeal and reached up to wipe up some of the latest tears away and send a comforting feeling to her as he did so. "I am not angered," he told her, truthfully, "but I need you to tell me what possessed you to seek vengeance on our own." Hi, Ajo. Merry Christmas. Marin bit her lip and looked away, studying some of the lubricant stains on the permacrete. "I don't know," she said after a moment, her fingers curling into fists. "He was all I had, and I didn't even get to see him that much." She tried to hold back another sob as she remembered how angry she'd been at him a few days before. Stefan felt it and didn't entirely understand it, but he knew where it could go. "Marin, listen to me carefully. You mustn't give in to that anger. Do you understand?" Marin looked back at him. "You don't get it. He promised. He said he'd be here, and then he leaves. I got angry and I screamed at him, and still he left." She turned away, sobbing as she remembered her cold, sinking feeling. Somehow she'd known. "I do get it," Stefan said as he got up and stood behind her, gently placing his hands on her shoulders. "And I also understand the turmoil in your heart. You are angry at him for leaving, angry at his death, and you want to take it out on those responsible. If you do that with the malice you're feeling, you will start down a dark path, just as your father did. I don't know if he spoke with you about what he did when he went down that path." "Not really," Marin shrugged. "Brandon told me more about that than Bouir ever did." Her tone was slightly bitter. "There may have been a reason for that," Stefan told her. "Your father did many things that we would consider terrible. He didn't just kill the ones he hunted for his wife and child's death. Jerry's hurt them severely before he killed them, putting them through things that only a few people would. Marin, it scarred him inside." He gently turned her around and knelt to where they were more eye to eye. "When Ethan and I finally found him and turned him away from what he'd been doing, his remorse for his actions almost overwhelmed him. It drove him to the point that he felt he could not live because he'd so greatly dishonored himself." He looked at her, wanting her to understand. "He buried that pain and anguish deep inside, Marin, for that reason. And that is probably why he never spoke much of it to you." Her shoulders slumped and she looked away, trying to bring her anger under control. It was challenging. Part of her liked it. He sensed it and could feel it burning inside. "Marin, he wouldn't want you to experience what he felt after going through that." She tensed and looked away guiltily, not wanting to admit that she liked how it felt. Stefan continued looking at her as he knelt there, waiting patiently. She squirmed uncomfortably under his gaze, her face heating as she tried to pull away. Stefan let go. He wouldn't force the situation, but he would let her talk when she was ready. She shrugged out of his grip and moved away from him. She'd know where she could go. Ethan was between her and the Tricinia's controls, and that thing was between her and what? Not freedom. She shivered involuntarily and sank down on the edge of Tricinia's boarding ramp, sensing Ethan in the lounge. She wanted so much for both of them to just go away. Ethan had overheard their conversation and saw her sit down on the boarding ramp. "We'll be here as long as it takes for you to talk," he said. "I'm patient, and the jettee there is way more patient than I am." Marin cringed as if Ethan had slapped her, wrapping her arms around her knees as she stared unseeing at the permacrete beneath her boots. Stefan walked towards the end of the hangar's permacrete, sat down with his legs crossed, and looked out over the forest beyond. It would take some time for this to be resolved, he was sure of that now, and he pulled his flute from his pocket of his tunic as he started to lower himself into the forest to meditate on how to comfort her. As he drifted into it, the song began to come from the flute at his lips. Slowly and mournfully at first, but he let the forest take his thoughts on the music as he started to meditate. Marin's head came up in surprise. That music. It pulled at her very soul and brought fresh tears to her eyes. She drew her knees closer, burying her face in her arms, and just listened. The only sound now was the soft notes of the flute and Marin sobbing. She could feel the music trying to soothe her, but part of her, it hurt. She could feel a small part of her screaming in silent agony at the sound. The music continued, Stefan's knowing the effect it was having on Marin, but it was as the Force willed it. He did not control it, so he let it continue as he opened himself more to the Force, soaking in the energies as he played. Marin's grip around her knees tightened. She probably would have drawn blood if she hadn't been wearing armor. And she did. She could taste the metallic flavor of blood on her lower lip. Ethan felt the music touching him as well. He got up from his seat and leaned against the bulkhead just inside Tristina's hatch with his eyes closed. Stefan continued his meditation until he started feeling the music coming to a close. When he felt the Force releasing him, he held the final note there for a few moments, and then let it fade into the soft noises of the forest around them. He lowered the flute to his lap, but stayed sitting with his eyes closed, still in thought as he faced the forest beyond the hangar. Marin sat there for a long time, tears tracing down her cheeks as she listened to the notes. Her questing fingers pulled Jerry's tags from beneath her armor, and she clung to them, whispering something under her breath in Mandoa. Stefan finally opened his eyes and looked at the sun starting to set over the mountains in the distance. It would be nightfall here sooner than he thought. "Marin," he called to her as he sat there. "Would you sit with me?" Slowly, Marin lifted her head from where she had been resting it on her arms. At his question, there was a brief nervous thought of Ethan and of what Stefan had to say. After a moment, she rose stiffly to her feet and made her way slowly to him, her gaze to the permacrete. He was singing softly in Katani as she approached and gestured for her to sit as he finished the chant. Marin sank slowly to the cool permacrete, staring into the swiftly gathering darkness beyond the hangar. She could hear the sounds of various creatures as they called to her. Welcome into the chat. Lacona. It was good to see you. As to your question, I personally think it's worth it if you can afford it, but you can still play the game without being a subscriber. However, without being a subscriber, there are some limitations to the game itself. There's like a credit cap limitation and things like that. So if you really enjoy the game and you want to continue playing and you can afford to subscribe, I would suggest it. It will remove the credit cap and various other restrictions. So if you can afford it, I would highly recommend it. But definitely don't break your bank just to subscribe. You can still do a lot without being a subscriber. So that is my advice. Give me 1 second while I check something. Oh, goodness. Okay. Marin sank slowly to the cool permacrete, staring into the swiftly gathering darkness beyond the hangar. She could hear the sounds of various creatures as they called to each other. "If you are able," he started to tell her softly as they sat there, "take in the sights, the sounds, watch the sunset, and see if you can partially clear your thoughts." She hiccuped and tensed slightly, but nodded. She let her eyes fall closed, but her shoulders were tense as she sat there. She shifted a bit uncomfortably. Being here brought forth too many memories. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to breathe through the sudden flash of anger and shame regarding how she'd spoken to her father. "Remember the calming technique your father taught you," he said. "Breathe deeply and hold it. When you release, let out all of your anger with your exhale." Marin swallowed and tried to follow his instructions. It was challenging, to be sure. Something caught in her lungs as she tried to breathe, sending her into a coughing fit. Stefan felt it and used the force to help steady her as she sat there. When her fit ceased, he continued to reach out to her and help her as she continued the technique. She gasped for a moment until her breathing evened out. Slowly, she began to focus on the technique again. Before it evened out, she almost started coughing again as she began to breathe more slowly. "That's it," he told her as he watched the sunset. "Just let it go." She couldn't help the sob that welled up as she breathed out once more and felt it echo slightly through the hangar. Force, it hurt. "It will for some time," Stefan told her softly. "Would you prefer to talk here after a while, or would you feel better in my study?" Marin shrugged. "It doesn't matter, I suppose," she said softly, looking down at her hands before she sucked at her bottom lip. He nodded softly as he watched the last of the sun disappearing behind the mountains. "If you feel well enough, I will fly Tresinia, and you may sit with me while Ethan follows us." "What about that?" she asked, pointing her chin towards the strange craft blocking the hangar entrance. Stefan nodded. "Blue Talon will follow along with us once I give it the proper commands from my wristcom. It would not be my first time piloting the mobile suit remotely." Marin shivered involuntarily as she looked up at it, but then she remembered reading about something similar. The ancient Basiliki. The basilisk war droids used by the Mandalorians centuries ago. This mobile suit didn't look like them, but she felt that it could do quite a bit of damage. She tensed a little at the mention of Ethan. She could feel that he was still quite upset. "Hey, Stitch Doll, welcome in." I can't type today. There we go. Yay, Frosty Tools is working again. It was broken for a few days. Stefan looked back towards the Tresinia and nodded. "He'll take some time before he cools off. He remembers all too well what happened with your father. He doesn't want to see you go down that path, although his method for showing his concern is too..." Marin flinched, dreading whatever discussion she and Ethan might have later. My sound alerts are being weird. Why is that not working? Did I not log in? I probably forgot to log in. No, I'm in there. I don't know. Sound alerts is being weird. It's working. You want Mando Flute? Okay, I can play Mando Flute for you. I don't know if you'll hear it, but we could try. Let's see. Oh, it's not even showing on my end, actually. Did you guys see it? Because I am not even seeing it on my end. Sorry. Sorry. I apologize if it was super loud. For whatever reason, it's not really working for me. Oh, no. Let me turn the volume down a little bit. Let's see.
I like those odds.
Yeah, it's not showing up for me at all. Like on stream. So I'll still have to do some testing with that. I don't know what's up. It's like I haven't gotten them to work for me at all. Like they were working, but now they're not. I don't know what's going on. I wish I could play it for you. I really do. Yeah, like I said, I've been having all kinds of technical issues this evening, which I didn't realize were a thing until as I started trying to go live. So I will have to work on that. Sorry about that, Stitch Doll. Oh, I'm sad now. I'll have to work on that. It's being cranky. Are you guys at least able to hear the music? I mean... Okay, so that works at least. I have to figure out what's going on with my sound alerts. Stuff is being really, really weird on my end. I don't know. Alright. So, sorry about those not working. I'll work on that. I don't know what's up. Okay, where was I? Trying to remember where I was. Come, he said softly as he got up. This might be better served in my study with tea and be hot. A smile tried to tug at the corner of her mouth as she climbed stiffly to her feet. She still couldn't quite bring herself to look up at him. Instead, she focused on studying the damage to the Tricina. Stefan watched her for a moment. Dylan told me he mostly hit the shields only. Marin nodded wordlessly and climbed the boarding ramp, feeling her shoulders tense as she walked past Ethan and towards the cockpit. She could feel his gaze follow her, but she ignored it, slipping into the co-pilot's chair instead. We have an ad starting in about 4.5 minutes. I'll fly Tricina, Stefan told him. Follow along behind us and we'll continue this in my study. Ethan only nodded and grunted as he walked down the ramp. Stefan waited for him to clear before he closed it and locked it down. With that done, he walked into the cockpit, tapping instructions for Blue Talon into his wristcom before he started the ship's engines. Marin sighed, her helmet clicking against her thigh plate as she drew her knees up. For a long moment, she just stared out the armor-plast canopy. Stefan glanced over. Would you want a few hours to rest? She shrugged. I guess. Go ahead, Stefan told her with a smile. It wouldn't have been the first time I've piloted this ship myself. Marin seemed to consider that a moment before she nodded and rose, moving slowly down the portside ring corridor into her cabin. All right. Catan. The 3 ships settled on the Card's landing pad several hours later. Jade was waiting for them on the corner of the landing pad until they had all disembarked before Stefan looked over at Marin. Whatever feelings he had about what had happened within the last few hours, he kept hidden as they approached Jade. Dylan, he started to say softly, once we're clear, lower the pad into the hangar. Ethan, Marin, let's take this into my study. Marin swallowed and nodded silently, slowly reaching up to unseal her helmet. She followed Master Card, feeling Ethan close behind her as they entered the house, holding the helmet in her arms as she did so. They walked around the living room from the entry and through the doorway that led to Stefan's study. 3 chairs were arranged in a triangle, with one's back to the door of the study. Stefan motioned for Marin to sit in that one as Jade walked in with 2 cups of caf and 1 of bihat, and a serving pot for each in case more was wanted or needed. Stefan motioned with his hand when she left the room and closed the 2 sliding doors into the study before he sat down behind the desk. Wordlessly, Marin nodded her thanks to Lady Card, cradling the warm mug in her fingers after she'd set her helmet on the table by the door. She nervously took the seat he'd indicated, as she heard the doors to the study close softly behind her. Stefan took his cup and walked to the window, quietly sipping the caf and gathering his thoughts for what he was going to say. He waited for a few moments before looking at Ethan and taking another sip of his caf. Marin, he started to ask quietly, do you realize what you've done in the last few hours? Marin started and then fell silent, nervously licking her lower lip. The blood from earlier had crusted slightly. She did know, but she also knew she hadn't killed anyone. She gripped her mug firmly, took a sip, and breathed slowly. There was a knot of dread in her stomach. She was silent a moment longer before she nodded, finally lifting her gaze to meet his. You attacked 3 of your fellow students, one of whom you have a close relationship with, Stefan began to say, heading off on a wild bantha chase which, if you hadn't noticed, started getting the attention of our military. A flight of Nighthawks was preparing to go up until I contacted the battle group commander and told him the situation. But what I find most troubling is this. He set his cup on his desk and looked at her. You heard and felt a pull inside, didn't you? Wanting to go after these people, feeling the anger inside. Erin nodded wordlessly, her lips trembling. She took a shuddering breath and wiped the heel of her hand across her cheeks. I did, she admitted after a moment, her gaze dropping to the floor. She was silent for a moment before she spoke again. You'd probably be mad too if the person who first gave you a chance was suddenly taken from you, wouldn't you? She said quietly, looking at the floor. I'm going to stop right there because we have an ad starting in about 12 seconds. Alright. Oh, man. I'm going to take some water. The ad break is a great time to get some water, get a snack, have a stretch, hug your kids, whatever you need to do and can do in a minute and a half. Yeah, I don't know what's up with my sound alerts. They're being weird. Sound alerts are being very weird. Thank you. I was wondering if anybody would notice that. I was wondering. Yeah. Yep, I'm wearing a Yoda shirt. Because I'm that nerd. Alrighty. We are back from our ad, it looks like. Alright. Okay, here we go. Stefan sat down in his chair once more and looked at her. You're speaking to someone who lost his parents when he was training to become a Jedi. That got her attention, and she stared at him in open-mouthed shock for a long moment. He merely nodded. But I had different training than you. With the support of Jade and my master, I could cope with it. It wasn't easy, especially when I discovered that a person I had to deal with years ago was the one responsible. I felt that same emotion you did, too. But, he added, that doesn't mean that I can just let what's happened tonight go unchecked. What he means is that you came real close to crossing a line that he and the other Jedi take very seriously, Ethan told her. It just happens to be one I take seriously, too, considering I saw some of your father's handiwork when he was on the warpath you were considering. Marin looked up at Master Card's last sentence, but then her gaze slid to Ethan before it dropped to the floor again. There were a few moments of silence before she finally asked, "So, what happens now?" She was realizing now just how close she had come to walking that path, and that fact scared her, but it didn't sway her from wanting justice brought against her father's murderers. "I told you vengeance will come," said Ethan, "but when you're ready for it, and will say when you are, and I'm not just talking about in a mental sense." "Brushing up against the darkness within takes something from each of us," Stefan told her. "It takes time to think about your actions. That time will be spent here. If he wishes, Ethan can continue your training here in the Mandalorian way and take you on any missions he sees fit. But you will remain here. You are a student and resident of this Praxium. As the master of it and your teacher, you are now my responsibility." Stefan stood once more, took up his cup of caf, and returned to looking out the window. "You're going to be given time alone to think about tonight for a while. At some point, I believe you owe an apology to Bran and Koya. As for Jared," he paused momentarily, "you owe him more than an apology." Marin gasped, her eyes wide, realizing what she had put Jared through. Her eyes filled with tears as the realization sank in. She turned her face away from them, staring at the wall, and felt the cold lump in her stomach sink a little lower. She knew there wasn't much she could say to make it any better. One of the sliding doors opened quietly behind her, and Stefan turned to see Dylan standing there. "Dracenia has been secured and is stored next to Blue Talon," Dylan said quietly. Stefan nodded. "We'll do routine checks on the systems. I want you and Rhenius to ride with Marin back to the Praxium. No student is to confront her about what's happened. For now, we'll forgo today's training." "Yes, Father," Dylan said as he bowed and backed away from the door. "I want your weapons belt," Ethan told Marin as he stood. "Right now." "Mven?" Marin turned to look at him in shock. She stared at him for a couple of heartbeats, knowing it was best not to argue. Not with the look in his eyes. Without another word, she stood, somewhat stiffly from wearing full armor and having sat for a while. She reached back and loosened the buckle, pulling the belt off carefully before she held it out to him without another word. Ethan took it and noted the attached weapons, including the training saber. He unclipped it from the belt and tossed it to Stefan, who caught it offhanded and looked over it with a sigh before he tossed it back to Marin. "That you will still need," Stefan told her. "You'll get this back when I see if you've cooled off any more," Ethan added after a moment. Marin stared at Stefan in confusion, fumbling the catch. She then looked at Ethan and nodded. "Understood," was her quiet reply as she gripped the training saber in her left hand. She still didn't fully understand why he'd given it back. After what she'd done, she'd expected him to keep it for a while. She turned to look at Ethan again, gesturing to her armor. "And the Beskar gem?" Ethan looked to Stefan, who nodded and told her, "It can be stored in your room and used when training requires it." Marin nodded, placing her tea mug on the tray as she gathered her boise. "Anything else?" she asked softly, her voice sounding dull, although she was trying to remember her manners at the very least. "That is all," Stefan said, quietly. Rhenius and Dylan were waiting politely in the living room, and Stefan nodded to them. Rhenius moved at his nod, heading outside to prepare the horses. Marin bowed politely without another word and followed Dylan outside with a sigh. She felt Ethan might have words with her later, perhaps. Ethan looked back at Stefan after she'd left the room, and Stefan saw the look in his eyes clearly. "If you're going to give her more Mandalorian talking to, give her time to think on this," Stefan said. "She's going through enough turmoil as it is." "Agreed," Ethan told him. "Now what?" "I want you to go through every log in Jairus' ship for the past several months," Stefan said as he drained his cup. "He's been on Deathwatch's trail for a while now. We need to know what he found. Zan and Callista should be making their way here soon, and I hope they can shed more light on this." Ethan nodded and headed to the ship. Stefan poured himself another cup of calf before taking his cup into the living room and sitting in his usual chair. He tried to casually sit down and cross his legs as he took a sip, but instead he set the cup down and brought his hand over his eyes to rub his forehead and wipe a few tears of his own. The journey back to the Praxium was mercifully silent. Reneus had taken the lead, placing Marin's mount behind his, with Dylan bringing up the rear as they moved up the trail single file. The swinging gait of her mount made her sleepy, and she found herself drifting into sleep before she shook herself awake. It was only a short time before they passed through the main gate to the Praxium itself. The courtyard was empty and still, as it was early, yet the sky to the east was just now showing hints of the sun peeking over the horizon. Without a word, Marin slid from her saddle, tossing the reins to Reneus and turning towards the dormitory. Reneus took the reins quietly and started to head back to the house. Dylan tied his own mount, walking towards Marin and matching her pace. They stayed quiet for a few moments until Dylan looked over her and said, "Come on, let's have a seat in the amphitheater." Marin swallowed and nodded without a word, letting her mind lead her to the same place she saw with Jarius all those months ago. Jarius. The thought of him brought fresh tears to her eyes, and she felt like she couldn't breathe. Dylan sensed it and helped her sit down. He knew most of her story, but still, after a moment, he asked her, "He was all you had, wasn't he?" Marin hiccuped and gasped as she tried to stop crying. She nodded silently at the question, staring down at the armored gloves she still wore, along with the rest of her armor, save the helmet clipped to her belt. Dylan nodded softly. "You're not the only one here who's lost," he said softly. "There are a few students. MasterCard has. Even I have." Marin looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "He was everything. He gave me a chance on Corelli, even though he could have turned me in for stealing, or worse. He gave you a new life," Dylan finished for her, nodding quietly. My new life brought me here. I didn't have the chance that you have to honor and avenge him. I'm sure my father told you now isn't the time." Marin nodded and sighed. I feel so lost." She pulled off the close-fitting hood, twisting the fabric in her fingers as her dark hair fell around her shoulders. "You will for a bit," he told her as he got up and walked towards the center of the amphitheater. "It will feel numb, like part of yourself is missing. My question is, how will you honor him from here on?" "I don't know," Marin admitted with a shrug of her armored shoulders. "I hadn't thought about it yet." She sighed, and Ethan hadn't mentioned anything about it either. She was silent for a moment, considering the various things she'd read about Mandalorian death rites. I'm gonna take a drink of water. Oh, man. "Will you wait until Father and Ethan tell you when you are ready, or will you try to sneak off again?" Dylan asked. "And when you go after them, will you strike with the anger I felt in you earlier?" She said, and then stopped, looking away. "I don't know." It was honest, at least. She didn't know how she was going to cope with the pain. Sorry. "I know you're not going to have an answer to that yet," Dylan said as he walked back towards her and helped her stand to her feet. "But it's something I want you to think about along with everything else while you're in meditation, or training, or whatever." He helped her up the steps and mentioned in passing, "I'll try to see about setting up some personal time with a few blaster remotes. Meditating will not help you work through how you're feeling." Marin laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Better the remotes than something or someone else," she said quietly. He walked with her into the dormitory and down the corridor to her quarters. Opening the door, she noted that Bran and Koya were not in there, nor was Jared. "You need to rest up here for a time," Dylan told her. "Bran and Koya are all right. They're resting in their quarters. I don't know where Jared is, but I'm sure my father has him occupied. I'll be here at the Praxium if you need anything, okay?" "Foray," she replied. Thanking him quietly, she bowed slightly. She was trying to find comfort in what she knew, but it wasn't helping all that much. She wasn't hiding her presence now, but she directed her mental shields again as she struggled with her grief. With a sigh, she turned to her bed and fell backwards onto it, staring at the ceiling as if she might find any answers there. She wasn't sure how long she'd lain there, but she got up stiffly after a while. She moved across the small room to the heavy trunk against the wall underneath the window. She then squatted down, tracing her fingers over the smooth surface of the durasteel lid. The smoothness was broken in one spot by some engraving in angular Mandoa script and a line of flowing Katani underneath it. Murin Durza. She traced each letter slowly with her finger, mouthing the words. They brought tears to her eyes, for she knew she'd never see him again. She breathed and let it out, but it became more of a stifled sob. She moved her left hand towards the small reader on the locking mechanism and pressed her thumb to the scanner, hearing the click as the lock disengaged. She then reached down and pushed the lid upwards until it rested against the wall. Inside, nestled in cushioning foam, lay her partial set of Beskar Gam. She slowly pulled out the stacking trays from the right side of the trunk and gently set them on the floor. There were more underneath and in the middle, but these were empty. She also pulled out the empty trays and put them on the floor beside her. On the left side of the trunk was a single deep tray with a layer of foam cut to fit the contours of her helmet. She fumbled a little as she unclipped it from her belt. With shaking fingers, she carefully set the helmet in its place and then removed her armor from the neck down, carefully placing each plate into its tray before putting it back into the trunk. The partial set of plates went to the bottom of the trunk first. Her chest and back armor followed these as she placed each tray with the plates into the trunk in the order she'd removed them, ending with the boot and shin armor on top. That way they would be ready when she needed them again. Then she took her gloves, placing them on the tray beside her helmet. The vest came next. She undid the clips on the vest, folding it carefully before she put it in the same tray. Then she took off her boots, her fingers shaking slightly as she loosened the laces, pulling them off before placing them in the trunk as well. Her coverall would need to be washed. She sighed and undid the closure at the neck, shrugging out of it before she tossed it into the laundry along with the hood. She stared at the trunk's contents for a long moment. The trays that would have held her weapons lay empty. She shook her head and turned away, closing the lid as she dug around in the drawers built into the closet for a set of sleep clothes and a towel. For once, she was glad that there was a fresher in each room. She didn't want to see anyone else right now. She removed her underwear, socks, and the tank she'd worn under the coverall and added them to the laundry. With that done, she draped her towel over the hook by the door to the fresher and stepped inside, turning on the spray. She hissed a surprised curse as the cold water hit her, but it warmed quickly. Slowly, she began to scrub away the sweat and grime, but she couldn't hold back her tears anymore. She leaned her head against the wall of the fresher, the hot water mingling with her tears. She remained like that for several minutes, the sound of the water muffling her sobs. Finally, she turned off the spray and stepped out, wrapping the towel around her middle. With her sleep clothes in hand, she sat on the edge of her bunk, staring at her hands before slowly pulling them on and crawling between the blankets. Drawing her knees up, she turned on her side. The tears hadn't stopped when she stepped out of the fresher, and now they trailed down her cheeks, soaking the sheets. After a moment, she slipped her hand beneath her pillow, grasping the cool metal that she found there. She drew her hand back and opened it, staring at the item nestled inside her fingers. Jerry's Katani Marine tags. She traced her fingers over the engraved lettering. He'd given them to her when she'd first come to the Praxium, something she could keep close to remind her of him when he was away on contracts. Marin closed her fingers around the tags, squeezing her eyes shut before she sorted out the chain and undid the clasp, slipping them around her neck. The metal was cool against her skin, but it reflected the void in her heart. She wrapped the fingers of her left hand around the tags and held them to her as she turned her back to the door. That was a really long chapter. Sorry. Oh, I need a break. Oh, goodness. Long chapter. Oh, sorry, that was noisy. Okay. Chapter 27. The Pajilo's cockpit was relatively quiet as the ship pulled away from Tatooine's gravity well and prepared to make the jump to hyperspace. What they found had been disturbing at best. Just as they were calculating the jump, the comm warbled with an incoming message, but the emergency tone preceded this one. Callista traded a look with Zan as she keyed the channel open. Zan was grumpier than usual after the search on Tatooine yielded empty leads and thousands of pagats and bribes that only amounted to keeping the Hutts from getting interested. A priority comm from Catan did nothing to brighten his mood. If this is another wild nerf chase card, you can stuff it crossways. Tatooine, you said. Sure, good news from Tatooine if you're looking for odds on the Boonta Eve. Callista shook her head. Zan, something's happened, but I'm not sure what. She trailed off as Stefan's face appeared on the holo. Stefan's face displayed the hurt the comment made as he looked from Zan to Callista on his side of the channel. A lot worse than that, actually, he told them. I don't know where, but Jarius was killed. Callista... Let me try that again. Callista gasped and swore. Well, at least that explained her slightly sick feeling in the last little while. When? And Marin? Zan's face ran through a gauntlet of emotions before assuming a waxy appearance. How? He asked quietly. It happened earlier this morning, Stefan told them. Marin and I both felt it in the Force. Being his daughter, she was able to see images of it happening. She shared them with me, and it looks like he was caught in a trap by Deathwatch. As for where, he continued, it had to have been close to Catan because his ship was set to automatically home in on Marin's comlink. It arrived here within a few hours. Callista glanced at Zan. She could see it in his eyes as he processed the information. Kirtzad, she whispered, remembering what Stefan had told her. And where is Marin? She asked carefully after a moment. She's safe on Catan, for now. But I will tell you that she almost went on the warpath. If Ethan hadn't been close by, she might have jumped out of the system before I could contact you. For now, he didn't tell them of the chase she'd taken them on. Callista closed her eyes briefly before she looked at Zan again. Sierra, she asked, sensing his mind was elsewhere. Zan's eyes flashed, but his tone was still even, though he looked absolutely murderous. I don't know the Katani system as well as I'd like. Any worlds more used to smugglers and riffraff mingling with the native populations? Stefan thought about it for a moment. Not in Catan's home system itself, but one of the outer colonies has seen smuggler traffic before. Ethan is here with me, and we could be there within 2 hours if you think that's where we need to start looking for where it happened. Zan was warring with his emotions, but he knew that the more people who joined the search, the better. We'll need the extra eyes, I think. He grew quiet for a moment, though, as though he was forcing himself to keep calm. But when we find something, I want first crack. I knew I would get that answer, Stefan told him. I'll have Dylan check on Marin right now, and then we'll start making our way. Callista looked at Zan, her forehead creasing slightly before it smoothed over. She could feel the faint shift in his emotions. Momentarily, she laid her hand on his arm before checking the navigation console. We can be there in 4 hours if I push the hyperdrive to the limits. Do it! Vengeance must be taken now, Zan growled. 4 hours, Card. We'll be there. I have to ask, Stefan said. I'm not sure if Marin coming with us will be a good choice, but I'll ask your opinion as she walks the path that you do. Zan couldn't answer properly as his anger was getting the better of him. Callista squeezed Zan's shoulder for a moment before she answered. How is she? Do you think she can remain focused given what happened? His sigh was heavy, but he nodded. Ethan and I talked with her in my study once we got her back to Catan. She will be okay with strength of numbers, especially having you two and Ethan there. She and Dylan can fly with Ethan. Given our enemy here, I'll take Blue Talon. Callista nodded. Agreed, and I'll do what I can once we get there. She grew quiet for a moment as if trying to rein in her own emotions. I know what it's like to lose someone too. She looked back up at Stefan's image. She'll need that understanding, so I think that's a good choice. We'll be there sooner than you, so we'll hang back and wait. Understood, was Callista's reply as she nodded and cut the comm. Zan was still not in the frame of mind to respond, but he was beginning to hum a tune. One that usually promised terrible things to an enemy. He didn't even notice the comm being cut. First blood. The tune sent chills up Callista's spine as she glanced sideways at him as she busied herself to finalize the jump calculations. Zanika. Stefan cut the comm on his end and looked at Ethan. I'll prep the ship, Ethan told him, but there's something about Zan's tone. I know, Stefan said as he leaned back in the chair. I sense it too. I'm gonna try to translate that. I'm gonna try to pronounce this because it's kind of important to the story. Please don't kill me for murdering it. I'm gonna get some water before I do that because it's kind of. Let's see. Zen didn't respond to Callista yet, but started to sing. Tong, Saren, Broka, Mandoade, Karta. The word, Aden, Tratu, Mandeam, Kandosi, Adu, Dum, Motir, Katra, Na, Trasinia, Gradua, Kun, Het, Su, Drausia. It's supposed to be more guttural than that, I'm sorry. It's on YouTube. You can find it, I'm probably murdering it. It's called, give me one sec. It's called, The Word, the Verda. You can find it on YouTube. I'm probably murdering it. He looked like he had just stepped out of Daryem itself. The fire in his eyes was so intense. The Kurt Sod woke up the mythosaur, Siarika. Mythosaurs don't like being awoken. Those that wake them pay in blood. He continued to sing. Kamerk, Tsad, Droten, Trok, Nyin, Uris, Aden, Dawer, Daverd, Adan, Tratul, Mandayam, Kandose, Adu. I'm sorry, murdering it. The words themselves, but his tone sent cold chills up her spine, and she could feel a sense of dread settle in her stomach. She swallowed involuntarily. Be careful, she said quietly, but she knew from his tone that he would do whatever he felt was necessary to bring justice to the Kirtsad. They wanted first blood, and they got it. But we'll have the last, even if the galaxy drowns in blood, he growled. 4 hours later, the Progila blinked back into existence as the small ship dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Catan system. Their destination grew larger in the forward viewport as they approached the colony world that Stefan had told them about earlier. She typed out a burst message to Stefan and sent it. We're in system. Were you able to pull the last coordinates from his flight recorder? We're waiting for you at the pad he used now, Stefan replied. Home in on me. Coming to you. She used the signal from his comlink as a homing beacon. The Progila settled on the pad a few moments later. Stefan was already waiting at the spaceport when they touched down. His hood covered his features, and he looked like a robed statue standing there waiting. Zane did a final check on his rippers and blasters before putting on his helmet. He was taking extra time to check over his weapons, as they would get a workout by the end of the day. He even made sure that his Biscod, the Mandalorian iron sword he never usually carried, was strapped over his back for ease of use, and that the blade was just on the dull side. He was going to enjoy this. Zane walked with Callista towards where Stefan and Ethan were waiting. He knew that his actions would be monitored closely, but for the most part, he couldn't have cared less. This time, he followed Callista's lead, a shadow of impending malice ready to be unleashed. Zan, Callista, Stefan nodded to them as they met near the edge of the landing pad. Stefan, Callista nodded. She was wearing full Beskar gam, her lightsaber riding low on her belt along with her rippers at her hips. We overflew the site where it happened, coming in. Ethan said. Whatever they used, the Hotune took out a block or two with it. No residual scanned? Zane asked, barely on the edge of calm. Callista nodded. Most likely high-yield explosives, military grade, she said, looking to Zan for confirmation. After a moment, she moved over towards Marin and knelt. Laying her hand on the girl's shoulder, she could feel the turmoil as Marin struggled for calm. Marin looked up. She, too, wore her full Beskar gam, and Callista nodded as she noted the colors. Callista remained kneeling for several moments, lending Marin support before she stood and walked back towards Zan. I did a check, Stefan told them. Beradium, small charge from the looks of it, but you know how powerful it is. Zan nodded. Sounds like them for sure. 2 blocks, though. They're fortified inside the perimeter, then. But I doubt they have much in the way of heavy-duty emplacements. Maybe some industrial repeaters, but that's about it. They rely on stealth more. We can expect ambushes frequently. I'm gonna stop right there, because we have an ad starting, like, now. Okay. I keep hitting things. Okay. See how far we get. Some of these chapters are somewhat short. Chapter 26 was actually quite long, so it took a while. It took like an hour to read it, something like that. Our ad is going to end in 1 minute and 25 seconds. I'm actually going to grab a snack. Give me 1 second, okay? Actually, 1 second. Yeah, I don't think I have my music over there. So. Well. Nah, I'll wait on the snack. We'll wait on the snack. I'll get it after. I don't think I added my, I didn't add my music source over there. It's all good. So all you guys would get would be dead air. Alright. And we're back from our ad. Thanks for sticking it out through the ads, guys. I appreciate it. Alrighty. When she heard that, Callista nodded. We'll have to be careful. I'd advise everyone to keep a weapon readily available. Surprises are no stranger to us, Stefan said as he took the lead down the street. His senses were as alive as ever, noting everything around them as they moved. No hostile intent that I can sense now. That won't last, Zan spat. They're just waiting until we get into a good position. Zan pulled his rippers. It's the Hatunla way, he growled. Stefan thought about that for a moment and then looked upwards towards the rooftops before he leaped to the roof on the left. When his boots hit the roof, he crouched low and looked around. Callista pulled her own weapons, keeping Marin between herself and Ethan as she brought up the rear. She turned outward from the group, scanning, and noticed Marin doing the same. Dylan took the same approach as his father, leaping to the building on the right above them, and nodded to his father as they carefully started to go at the same pace as the group below. Marin glanced toward Callista and Ethan, taking her cues from them as she drew her D10s and flipped off the safety. She didn't see anyone, but she had the odd feeling of being watched. She was glad for her helmet sensors, so she could keep her eyes forward but still see the entire area. She paused for a moment as she felt a faint spike off to her left. She then glanced toward Ethan and Zan, knowing she'd best leave it to the adults. Zan's mood didn't improve as they slowly traveled along the rooftops. He hung back while the others progressed as though he would cover their six, but when they made their way to the next section of the street, Zan dropped into an alley and began making his way down the street. Stefan looked over to his left. Marin, stay close to Ethan and Callista, he said. Marin frowned, but replied, Yes, Sensei. Her desire for vengeance made her chest ache, but she took a slow breath and suppressed her anger so that she could try and stay focused. Callista noticed Zan duck into an alley and shook her head. I hope you know what you're doing, Sierra, she thought. This plan of Zan's was not the most genius of battle plans, but if he served as a distraction, the less heat would be on the others. As he made his way down the street, he finally spotted a target. Without a word of warning, he aimed and fired. Soon the calm was broken by a steady stream of Ripper shots as he fired into the hapless scout, beheading at him with the amount of fire directed at him. But now the calm was broken. Kirt Sad! Gar Talin Koir Nur! Sorry, I don't want to shout. Stefan heard the shots and was all right until he heard Zan yell the challenge. Now they would come out of the woodwork, he thought. Callista adjusted her grip around her rippers, continuing to scan the area. And then, there they were. One by one, she saw them. Marin swore as multiple contacts suddenly popped onto her center screen. They'd been stealthed. Simultaneously, two appeared on Stefan's side of the rooftops with weapons drawn. Stefan didn't give the first time to line up a shot as he leaped into the air and came down with his lightsaber spearing through the center of his helmet. The second was caught by surprise, so much that he was still there when Stefan rammed him shoulder first and sent them both over the edge, headed for the street below. Dylan saw his father's actions, but didn't see the result as his danger sense flared, and he drew his lightsaber on instinct, flipping it backhand as he started an infinity arc that caught several shots meant for him. She sent two back into one of the attackers. The second pressed in. Knowing that they would fall in front of the others, Stefan force-hammered his opponent hard, sending him smashing through the roadbed, cracking the surface as he landed away from the crater. His lightsaber was still ignited in a one-handed grip. Callista swore and swung her ripper around to cover their six as her right hand dropped to her thigh plate. An instant later, her saber fell into her palm. She thumbed it to life, blocking blaster bolts one-handed as she tried to draw a bead on one of the shooters. Zan's ripper sang as he saw three contacts pop out of nowhere in front of him, and he bellowed once more. Oi, Amanda! These were harder to kill than when the first shots were fired. The other two had ducked into cover. He had to duck behind an abandoned stall to discard cartridges and slam in new ones. He almost had this done when two more popped into view just in front of him, forcing him to abandon his game plan and use his blasters. Marin knew her training saber might not do much good, but she kept it handy as she tracked the armored figures in front of them one by one, as Ethan had taught her. She grinned in satisfaction as one and then the second fell to her shots. Dylan's remaining attacker brought both of his blasters up, hoping to catch him at point-blank range. The younger Jedi severed both barrels with one swing and quickly spun around in an arc to decapitate the man. Stefan saw two coming around a corner with heavy weapons in hand and was preparing to bring them to bear. They had two more in support right in front of where he landed. His lightsaber dispatched one of the heavy weapons carriers in short order as he stretched his hand and slammed the support gunner through the far wall. The other two brought their weapons up, but suddenly felt cold as his lightsaber had flown in an arc and cut them both down. The weapon returned to Stefan's hand, and he brought it around to his right side before returning it to his belt. Zan managed to kill one of his attackers with a well-timed shot into the visor, but the second managed to do some damage as Zan was diving behind the stall. Thanks to his armor, the shot to the vulnerable left side was actually kept from killing him. Zan swore as he rolled up to the balls of his feet, preparing to unleash another barrage. Need to get more time practicing on my basics. I've gotten a little weak, he thought to himself. Callista kept Ethan to her left, so his blasters covered their flank, and Marin covered their right as they moved down the street. Ethan, hotad kama, she told him as she leaped forward and to the left, driving her amethyst blade into the chest of the man who had popped around the side of the nearest building. There wasn't anything for Ethan to say when the assault came. He was all business now, and in the zone as 1, 2, 3 went down under his blasters. He may not be sensitive to the Force, but years of combat gave him an awareness of what was happening and knowing that the others had it covered. He saw his role right now as keeping Marin in sight and protected as he drilled another attacker down through his visor. Standing here ain't going to do anything, he hollered to the others. I say it's time to give this some momentum. Agreed, Stefan said as he looked across at Dylan. 3 in the next alley with Zan. Get over there. Zan knew he was getting pinned down, and he cursed himself for thinking of doing this alone. But he'd made his bed. As he unleashed another barrage towards his enemy's semi-hunkered position, he regretted leaving his lightsaber on board the Brigila. Darmanda, show your face, he growled, hoping to distract his opponent. I'm no Darmanda, jitty weakling, his opponent said, and popped out to unleash a flurry of shots, which were stopped dead by a well-placed shot into the scout's throat. I'll give him top cover, Dylan said as he saw more on the rooftops heading that way. Marin saw Callista move off to the left, and she was hard-pressed to keep her attention on her task as she saw the speed at which the older woman moved. She gaped for a moment before she shook herself and swept her blasters back and forth, scanning. She spotted one on the roof, trying to draw a bead on the older woman. Sighting down the barrel over the DE-10, Marin drilled a blaster bolt right through the man's visor. He collapsed to the roof before the trio moved forward again, Callista in the lead. Zan was running low on power packs and ammo. Now you see why anger dulls the senses till it's time to strike, he thought, as he moved into position to face the other 2 Death Watchers that had him pinned. He fired a useless volley of shots and then had to hunker down again. Nearly out of power packs, he thought. Callista felt the spike from Zan, and she took off at a dead run, her lightsaber spinning to block the incoming bolts, many of which flew back in the direction they had come, drilling through visors, throats, knees. She skidded around the corner with Marin and Ethan on her heels. Zan, coming to you. She sprinted down the alley as she narrowed down his location. Shoving her ripper into its holster, she dropped into his hiding place. Need a hand? She asked as she tossed him a spare power pack and her other lightsaber. The two Kirtsad rechecked their weapons, and one pulled a concussion grenade and was getting ready to prime it when they heard the shots above them. The lead shrugged it off until he heard a yell. He looked up to see the tip of Dylan's blue lightsaber before it ran down his spine. The man dropped like a stone as the other started to bring his weapon to bear, but Dylan pulled his blade and brought it around in a wide arc that bisected the man. He spun his blade and looked around before turning to where he'd seen Zan. Clear! Zan nodded at Callista and popped up when Dylan finished with the scouts. Good work, Vaughn. Let's keep moving. Zan ignited the spare lightsaber. While it was out of balance for him, it was better than relying on his blasters alone. Stefan stood and looked at the bodies strewn all over the street. They're not going to stop with just these. Callista shook her head. Nash, they won't. Another couple of blocks between here and where the blast happened, Ethan said as he holstered his blasters and brought his carbine up to bear. I don't get it. If this was a setup for Jarius, why stick around when you know there will be others looking for answers? It's an invitation to get killed, or worse, get caught. A series of muffled booms were heard, followed by a couple of cracks and a high-pitched whine. Zan knew what it was. Sonics! Take cover! Fairfic! Callista dove behind the wall, instinctively pulling Marin to the ground and covering their heads. She tried to throw up a force shield, but wasn't sure how much good it would do. Stefan ducked behind one of the buildings and crouched low. Dylan did the same on the opposite side of the street. Zan ran and dove into a dilapidated building, hoping the walls would hold against the wave of sound long enough for him to not get his guts turned to jelly by the concussive wave. And I lost a whole section of the chapter there, so I'm sorry. So we're skipping. There was another scene farther along, and it got lost somewhere in all of my edits. I need water. Okay. Okay. Catan, the Praxium. Bran and Koya were talking in low tones as they sat on the ground outside the training circle. Bran looked up and noticed Master Card was starting to walk through the main gates with Dylan in tow. Merrin appeared behind them a few moments later, and Master Canadius and Jacerin were behind her. Bran nudged Koya, and his friend turned to look, noticing Merrin as Bran got up. Merrin didn't even notice them. She walked with her shoulders hunched over, her helmet clutched in her left hand. Her hair was mussed, tendrils having come free of her braid to float about her face. Her face was covered in dust, broken only by tear streaks. Her black and orange Beskar gam was marred by dirt smears and even a little carbon scoring. But what she carried, cradled in her arms, was what she stared at. She barely saw where she was walking, only Callista's gentle hand on her shoulder keeping her from bumping into things. Bran and Koya looked at each other, wondering if they should even approach. They looked to Master Card, who shook his head softly before raising his hand to signal that they should wait. Merrin, he said softly as he turned to look at her, would you want some of your friends to help you? He gestured to where Bran and Koya were standing. Slowly, Merrin lifted her head, the expression of pure pain clear. She looked to Master Card for a moment, her lips trembling as she felt Callista squeeze her shoulder. We'll be around if you need us, Marika, Callista told her softly. Merrin nodded to the older woman, squeezing her hand for a moment before she turned back to Master Card, nodding silently. She clutched the object in her arms to her chest as if she didn't want to let it go. Stefan motioned for Bran and Koya to join them. When they did, the pure pain on Merrin's face was clear. She was holding a badly scorched blue and gray helmet that they had never seen before, but they knew immediately who it belonged to. They could only guess what was in the bag she had over her shoulder. Merrin? Bran asked as they came up to her. Merrin looked up, her lips trembling as she tried to hold back yet more tears. Bran, Koya, she whispered, her hands shaking as she held the blue and gray helmet to her chest. She stared at it for a long moment, tracing the scorch marks with her gloved fingers. She then looked up and seemed to shake herself. With a bit of difficulty, she passed the pack over to Bran. It rattled with a metallic sound. She handed her helmet to Koya, keeping the scorched blue and gray one in her arms. Thank you, Stefan said as they accepted what she handed over. Where is Jared? He's not here, Sensei, Koya answered. He ventured out after you had left Catan and was out all night. Stefan had figured that this might happen, so he stretched out his senses to see where his student was. He lowered a hand onto Merrin's shoulder to offer her comfort. Merrin choked back a fresh sob, her fingers tightening around the burden in her arms. She could only begin to guess what Jared had felt after what she'd done. For a long moment, the only sound in the courtyard was her muffled sobs. He's to the southwest, Stefan told her quietly as he looked along that heading. I see a clearing with a large tree close to the shoreline. He's in a familiar spot, so it won't be hard to get there. Merrin nodded wordlessly, her gaze sliding to Bran and Koya momentarily. She wasn't about to leave her father's Beskar gam. Not now. She looked back to Master Card, struggling to keep her voice even. May I go, Sensei? She asked after a moment. He nodded gently and looked at the others. Please, be gentle with those items and place them in your quarters. Yes, Sensei, they said as they started to move towards the dormitory. Merrin watched them go, her gaze following them until they disappeared into the dormitory. She still clutched Jerry's helmet and wasn't about to part with it. She bowed stiffly before turning towards the gate, her eyes drifting closed as she tried to find Jared within the force. It was a long moment before she opened her eyes again, and her steps were slow as she moved towards the gate. I'm slouching. Caught myself. Oh, sorry. He had stayed camped there all night with the sounds of the woods and the crackling of the fire in front of him for company as he leant back against the massive tree he'd found. The sounds of the shore nearby were soothing to him as he looked up at the night sky. It was first light now, and he tossed a few more pieces of wood that he cut into the fire to keep it going. He hoped it would keep him company as he tried to meditate, but peace had been escaping him thus far. It was all turmoil inside. It took Marin almost an hour to get to him. She was finding it rather challenging to keep her sorrow in check. She was sure that everyone could feel it, and she didn't much care. It felt as if her heart had shattered into a million pieces. She did close down a little. She wasn't sure how Jared would react when he saw her. Finally, she shuffled around the bend in the trail, the faint sound of waves washing to the beach reaching her ears. The breeze was cool here, ruffling her hair as she scanned the area ahead. There was the tree that Master Card had told her about. A small fire flickered beneath it, and next to the fire, she hung back, choking back a sob as she saw him huddled there, staring into the flames. He turned his head, having sensed her coming for some time, and saw her standing there, still in her armor and clutching something in her arms. He could feel the sorrow pouring off of her, and he started to get up as she moved closer. Marin hiccuped and reached up to wipe her nose with the back of her hand, leaving a dusty smudge across her cheeks. She was silent for a long moment, just looking at him. When she reached the edge of the circle of light cast by the fire, she collapsed to her knees and stared into the flames for a long moment before she spoke. Jared. Her voice was soft and filled with tears. She couldn't even bear to look at him as she remembered what she'd done. No word was said, but a moment after she'd whispered his name, his arms went around her tightly, pulling her close. "You're back safe," he whispered as he closed his eyes and continued to hold her close. Marin turned and buried her face against his shoulder, tears beginning to soak through his tunic. She remained like that for a long time until she finally cried herself to exhaustion. Finally, she looked up, her dark eyes troubled. She raised a hesitant, shaking hand to brush his cheek, not even noticing that her gloves were covered in dust and grime. "Dear lady, Jared, I'm so sorry." Her lips trembled again, and she tightened her grip on the helmet in her lap. "Marin," he whispered as he held her hand to his cheek before he leaned in to kiss her deeply. Anything to alleviate at least some of her burden. When he finally moved his head back, he softly whispered to her, "I understand why, my love. I forgive you. I do." Marin hiccuped, but his gentle kiss swallowed it. She felt it wash over her and surround her with warmth. It lessened her pain somewhat, but it was still there. She clung to him as tears threatened again. "Jared, She leaned into his chest once more and slipped the fingers of her left hand into his. "I feel like such a découte for what I put you through," she said, softly, staring down at the blaster burns and other damage that covered the dome of the helmet in her lap. Jared looked down at the helmet she held and the damage there. "You had your reasons," he told her. "I understand them now as I did then. I didn't want you rushing out, though. I didn't want to lose you." "Well, you didn't," she said softly, squeezing his hand. Etika saw to that. She chuckled a little, remembering the chase above Catan, but she sobered as her thoughts drifted to their trip to the colony and what they'd found. The dust and grime on her armor were hidden by the dim light, as was the carbon scoring from a few shots that had come too close. He looked over her armor, seeing the marks and the dirt, as well as the close calls. He almost wanted to curse himself for not demanding to go along, but he knew that he was still learning his chosen weapon. "I've got a pack here that we could put your plates in if you want," he said as he traced her cheek. Marin nodded quietly. "I'd like that." She wiped the heel of her hand across her cheeks before she rolled to her knees and hefted Jairus' helmet for a moment, looking into the fire before she laid her forehead against the visor. Her words were soft and spoken in the Mandalorian tongue. "Ne sequoia gar kiadish, ne partaili gar darsum. Beware." Jared leaned against the tree and held her close under his arm. He looked towards the makeshift woodpile he had made and used the force to place a few more pieces on the fire. Marin was silent for what felt like an eternity. When we found where it had happened, there wasn't much left. Whatever explosive they used destroyed about 2 blocks around the blast zone. I don't know how his plate survived, but Beskar is pretty tough. From what Zan and Callista could find out from the computer on his ship, he'd taken a contract thinking that it was legit. It turned out to be a trap. The Kirtsad were waiting for him. They'd rigged the entire warehouse with beradium and lured him inside. She sniffled, her fingers tightening around the helmet in her lap. We had a hell of a time even getting to it. We had to fight through them. How many were left waiting for you? Jared asked quietly. Marin shook her head and shrugged. I don't know. They just came out of nowhere once we got close to the blast zone. I'd say at least 24, maybe more. He nodded and continued to hold her close. It was a setup for him? As near as we can figure. Lek, she answered quietly, her thumb tracing the blaster scoring. When the time comes, Jared said quietly, maybe we can repay them in kind in the same manner. Marin shrugged. Perhaps. But I don't want to do it out of anger. Mando at Vengeance is about justice. I'm not looking for revenge. I don't want to go down that path. She shuddered at the memory of how she'd felt then and how it had changed Jerry's when he'd gone down the same path years before. Good, Jared said as he looked at her. I'm glad, because that is a path that I didn't want you to walk, because I would not be able to follow you. And I want to be there with you. He reached out with his other hand and traced her cheek again. Marin closed her eyes, shuddering at the touch. It made her stomach flutter, and yet at the same time it was soothing. I don't know what to do. I want to honor him, but I'm not sure how. Shh, he said as he traced her cheek. We'll figure that out later. Right now, you look like you need rest more than anything else. Marin sighed and nodded, clutching Jerry's helmet to her chest as she felt his touch and the warmth of the fire lulling her to sleep. Jared pulled her closer and rubbed her back as he felt her drifting off in his arms. She snuggled into his chest, and soon the only sounds were her soft breathing and the fire crackling as the sun climbed higher into the sky. Okay. Chapter 28. All right. Slowly, Marin woke. She didn't want to move. She opened her eyes and squinted, taking in where she was. The fire had died down to embers, but it still gave off some heat. She snuggled deeper into Jared's arms before remembering what she held cradled in her lap. Tears silently traced down her cheeks as she gazed at it, and she began to remember. The anger she'd felt the day before. Some of it was at Jarius for leaving, but more of it was at herself for screaming at him as she had. She'd never done anything like that before. The memory made her cry a little more as she held the helmet to her chest. Her crying was what woke Jared. He looked at her and pulled her closer, knowing how she was feeling. He didn't say anything, but continued to hold her. He looked at the dying fire and saw that he had 2 pieces of wood left, so he placed them on the fire and just lay there quietly. Marin sniffled and laid her head on his shoulder, the tears soaking into his tunic. It was a long moment before she finally spoke, and even then it was quiet. I can't help but think that maybe if I told him how I was feeling, he would have stayed. I was so angry. He promised me he'd be here, and then suddenly he gets a call, and the next thing I know, he's packing to go. I screamed at him, telling him he'd promised, and then I ran. I didn't know why then, but I had this horrible feeling that something bad would happen, and I know he'd felt it from me. She broke off then and started sobbing again. From what I have heard and understood, he started to say quietly, He was very committed to finding these people. I'm pretty sure the Mandalorians don't want to leave any openings for this group to get away. So, wouldn't they have to know if this information was accurate? I guess, she said after a moment, shrugging. He didn't ask for anyone to help him, though. Fairfax, if only I'd told him. Maybe he didn't want to show a force, Jared asked, trying to see the situation from all sides. Probably, she allowed after a moment's thought. He was rather good at skulking around. She grinned slightly, but there was a tinge of sadness to it. With everything you already knew and learned from him and Master Card, you could also scout around later. He shrugged at the idea. He could sense her starting to cheer up at least a little. What do you mean? Continue the search? They're not going to stop until something is done, Jared told her. We all said, when the time is right, we go after them. She sighed. You're right, I suppose. I feel like it's my fault. If I'd told him, maybe. Then she shook her head. There wasn't any use debating it now. I'm gonna stop, because we're about to have an ad. Oh, man. Sorry. Sorry, I don't want to mute, because it's gonna break the closed captioning. I'm okay. Promise I'm okay. Not cough drops, but water. Yeah. Oh, man. The tail end of this cold is just playing a little havoc on my ability to breathe properly, apparently. Yeah, that's the thing. I'll be okay. Promise. I'll be fine. We have an ad that's gonna end in about a minute and 25 seconds. Go get a drink, grab a snack, have a stretch. Which is what I was attempting to do when I started coughing. Yeah. Oh, man. Oh, man. The last one. The one I was attempting to talk about earlier. It's actually a Mandalorian song called The Word of Verda, or Warriors of the Shadow. You can look it up on YouTube. It's actually fascinating. It's like a war chant. It's actually really cool. Let me see if I can find it, actually. 1 second. I will see if I can find it. I was probably butchering the pronunciation. Here we go. Yeah, I was completely butchering it, but anyway. There we go. Listen to that at your leisure. It's essentially a Mandalorian war chant. So. Okay. Yes, it's good stuff. Okay. Jared leaned over and kissed her forehead softly. If there was any fault in this, it's theirs, not yours. She sighed and slumped a little. You're right. She then looked up at the sky above them. It was past midday already. We should probably start heading back. I don't know about you, but I'm hungry. Yeah, he said as he looked up. I've been gone for a while. There have probably been some people worried. He let her get up first and then got up himself before throwing dirt back over the coals and filling in the hole. Marin started to reach for her pack, but he stopped her, picked it up, and put it over his shoulder, holding her hand as they started to make their way back. She almost protested, but then shrugged, clutching Jarius' helmet again. Their slow progress allowed her to see the forest and the wildlife she'd missed the last time, but it also brought a swell of sorrow. Jarius had loved the forest, especially at home in the Tanaga system. The mood in the Praxium was subdued as they entered. By now, the others who considered themselves close friends to Marin knew what had happened and nodded softly as they walked into the courtyard. Master Card saw them and nodded, letting Jared know that he understood their need for some time. Marin saw his glance and she tried to smile, settling for a simple, respectful nod when that didn't work. She was silent as they walked across the courtyard to the dormitory. It felt odd to wear even part of her Beskar gam inside the Praxium walls. Jarius never had, and now she understood why. Being in the Praxium for her was soothing. She led the way up to her room, shoving the door open with her foot and made her way towards the bunk, carefully setting Jarius' helmet on the table next to it. The pack containing his plates had been placed in the center of her bed. She moved it carefully to the end and sank down on the edge of the mattress for a moment. Do you want me to open the trunk for you? Jared asked as he stood there at the foot of the bed. Marin's lips quirked. I'd better. It's keyed to my thumbprint. She slid off the bed and crossed to the trunk, pressing her thumb to the reader. The lock clicked a second later. She smiled at him as she pushed the lid back against the wall before pulling the trays from inside the trunk. Wait a second, Jared said as he noticed something. A piece of flimsy had fallen out of one of the trays as she had lifted it out of the trunk. What's this? He asked as he picked it up and turned it over. It has your name on it. Ven? Marin peeked over his shoulder. It was indeed a piece of flimsy with her name written on it. How did... She started to ask, and then she saw the writing. Only one other person could override the lock on her trunk. He was the only one who could have put something there. But when? With shaking fingers, Marin took the piece of flimsy from Jared's hand. It was neatly folded in half with her name scrawled across the front in familiar handwriting, in Mandoa characters. Slowly, she unfolded it, her vision blurring slightly. She closed her eyes briefly to keep tears from dripping onto the page and smearing the ink. She sank down on the floor next to Jared, her free hand finding his as she choked back fresh tears. He knelt and held her close as she began to read. Marin clutched the flimsy, her fingers shaking and her voice choked by tears as she read the Mandoa script. Her voice was barely above a whisper. When she got to where he said that he'd felt as if he'd betrayed her, Marin choked back a sob. When it had subsided to sniffles, she continued reading. She could feel that same cold lump settling in her stomach. He wouldn't be coming back. She finished the letter and sobbed, burying her face into Jared's shoulder. He held her close as she buried herself into his shoulder. Slowly, he took the letter from her hand and read it over, remembering what Marin had taught him of the Mandoa script. Marin, even though I have to head out to check this lead, I still owe you an explanation. The man who tried to recruit me into Deathwatch was named Danos Joran. He'd been a fellow Marine before he had disappeared. And I think we're gonna start that ad. Disappeared for some time. There had been rumors that he'd also been an assassin for hire, something that turned my stomach when I heard about it. When he approached me for Deathwatch, I already had an idea of the organization and turned him down at Blaster Point. I'm pretty sure that the ad is going. He was the one who claimed responsibility for the death of my family. You know about the rampage that I went on. I took an oath with my own blood that I would see the man dead or brought to Mandayam in irons. After training with Master Card, I know the right thing to do was to bring him to justice, alive. I received a call from someone with a 3-day window to achieve that very goal. I have to investigate this, even if I can just put a tracker on the ship he's using so I can get Zan or Ethan or any other Mandawade to bring this Jakar down. I know that I promised you I would be here longer than this. My daughter, I know my word means a lot to you. It also means everything to me. If nothing else, I have tried to teach you more than anything that your word is who you are. There are no exceptions to that. But it feels like I have betrayed you more than anything else I could have done by having to leave her sooner than I expected. Seeing the hurt on your face hurt me more profoundly than I could have shown, and I cannot even begin to apologize for hurting you in such a way. You are my daughter, and I love you very much. I am sorry for not being there more than I have and for cutting our time together short. I swear it will be made up after I've done with this assignment. After this is done, there will be nothing further that will demand more of my time than you do. We will spend more time together at the Praxium learning and at home, trying to keep together the family I feel we should be. I know you are upset with me and will not want to forgive me so quickly for what I have done, but when I return, I hope we can sit down and plan where we go from here. Love, Beware. You felt like he betrayed you? Jared asked as he got to that point. What would make him feel that way? Marin sniffled and wiped at her nose with the back of her hand. To Amanda Wad, their word is a bond. If they say they will do something, they intend to do so. He promised me he would stay, and when he told me about the call, I got so angry. He broke his promise to me. I screamed at him, and then I just ran. Did he try to catch up? Jared asked, looking at her with concern. Try to talk to you? Anything? She nodded. Alec, he did, but I was so upset. When he told me about the call, I had this horrible feeling that something would happen. When he caught up to me, I pushed out of his embrace, flooding our bond with those feelings before I ran. He didn't follow after that. She sobbed again. I feel like it's all my fault. Jared kept reading until he reached the end of the letter. He was planning to make it up after he found this Joanne person. She nodded. And he never came back. She drew her knees up, staring across the room, but not really seeing anything. Jared read over the first part of the letter a few more times. Does anyone believe this was a setup? I don't know. I know Beware said that he'd talked to Master Card after his meditations the other day. He'd given me an odd look, and he never told me why. I couldn't explain my feelings when he told me about the call. Somehow, I knew. She shrugged. Maybe Master Card would know. Sorry. I have a feeling it is, Jared said as he looked over the letter again. Master Card had been giving him instructions on investigative matters as a Jedi, and he was starting to see a pattern in the letter that Jarius had left. I think I may need to speak to Master Card about this. Marin looked up at him. Do you think I should be there? I did have this awful feeling as soon as he mentioned it. If you want to, Jared told her, but I think I need to bring this with me. I'm getting a feeling here. Okay, she said, her tone a little reluctant as she let him take the letter from her fingers. I should probably tell him about the discussion Beware and I had just after he came back this last time. Jared nodded and kissed her softly. Do we need to wait and rest a bit? Marin shrugged. I don't know. She leaned against his shoulder, trying to calm her roiling emotions. As hard as she tried, she couldn't fight the feeling of guilt that had settled in her stomach. She felt like it was her fault. Jared could sense it too and pulled her closer. I know, and I don't know of anything I could say to make you feel otherwise right now. She clung to him for a long moment, not wanting to let go. After several minutes, she took a deep breath and wiped the heel of her hand across her face. I suppose I should change before we go and talk to him, she said, softly, looking down at her grimy coverall. I'll wait outside, Jared said as he got them both on their feet before he headed for the door. She gripped his hand for a moment, not letting go, before she leaned in to kiss him softly. I'll be out in a few minutes. And then she released his hand, turning towards the closet. She heard him close the door softly as he left the room. She stared at the clothes in her closet for a long moment, her vision blurring. Rubbing the heel of her hand across her cheeks, she blinked back the tears. Her fingers shook as she pulled a pair of black trousers from their hanger and a tunic of blue so dark it was almost black. On the upper left chest of the tunic, worked in blue, the same shade as Jarius' tunics, in delicate embroidery, was the Bevan clan sigil. It was also embroidered across the back of the tunic. She laid these out on the bed and stepped into the fresh air, scrubbing off the dust, grime, and even a little blood from the previous day. She turned off the water and returned to the room, toweling off briskly before she dressed. She pulled the tunic and trousers on with care, smoothing the fabric with her fingers after she pulled on her boots. She then brushed out her hair, leaving it loose. She slipped Jarius' tags around her neck. Now, she was as ready as she would ever be. She took a deep breath and stepped out into the corridor. Her face was still, but her eyes were haunted and filled with the deep pain and the guilt she felt. A setup? Stefan asked as he turned to look at Jared and Marin, who stood in the doorway to his study. I'm beginning to believe so, Sensei, Jared answered as he held up the letter. Just from reading this, it sounds like this anonymous contact must have been this Danos Duran that Jarius was looking for, and it was a perfect lure to get him there. Stefan nodded and looked at Ethan, who had joined them as well. Your thoughts? Marin was silent, listening to the discussion as she fingered Jarius' tags. It had been a lot more than even she'd expected. She thought that they would have cleared out after taking him out. That thought almost started her crying again, and she took a deep breath, trying to ease the ache in her chest. Jared settled his hand on her shoulder to help calm her. You may be more right about this than you think, Jared, Stefan told him. What concerns me is that they could operate long enough to pull something like that off. After the incident today, I know that the authorities will not move the battle group surrounding Galan for a long time until there is an investigation. Marin's fingers curled around Jarius' tags. She didn't get it. Jarius himself had said he was being careful, and yet Kirtzad had been able to track him right to the Praxium. That made her stomach knot again, and she pondered how to voice her thoughts. She knew Master Card and Jared could sense her feelings, at least. Stefan looked over to Marin and to Jared. Marin, he asked, do you need to work out some of the feelings you're dealing with right now? She was silent for a moment before she nodded. Alec, she said softly, finally lifting her gaze to his. She paused to take a breath. There's something I don't get, though. Weir said he was taking precautions to cover his movements, and yet the Kirtzad were able to track him, not only to the Catan system, but to the Praxium itself. It is a grave concern of mine, Stefan said, as he nodded. It's being looked into, Marin. Because of the severity of this incident, the Katani High Command wants to investigate. I will talk with them later today, but I feel this will also involve some outside help. She frowned. What do you mean? She traced Jarius' tags again, trying to breathe through the lump of guilt in her stomach. If only I'd told him. What Master Card is saying is that we're going to pull some more Jetise into help, Ethan told her, and what few Mandawade there are that would have no objections to working alongside them, as long as it means putting Deathwatch down like a rabid rancor. Between the two groups, we should be able to track them down. Stefan looked toward Marin and saw the underlying concern. Would you feel better talking to Andrea, Marin? I don't know, she said quietly, clutching Jared's hand. She nervously smoothed her tunic. After a moment, she allowed, I'd like her to be here, though. She felt they all needed to hear what she was about to say. I believe I was about to be called, Andrea said as she walked into the room. Little Ian hung on her skirts until Jade picked him up and carried him into the music room. Andrea walked in and knelt to wrap her arms around Marin. What do we need to hear? Marin blinked, but she supposed Andrea would have picked up on that. She took a deep breath. I suppose that I should start from the beginning, when Buir came back to the Praxium this last time. Stefan took his seat at his desk and nodded for Ethan to take his place before he motioned for her to continue. Marin swallowed and leaned into Andrea's embrace even as she clutched Jared's hand. When Buir came back to tell me he would be staying for a while, he told me a little bit more about his past. I'd asked if he was going after them again, and he said, "I'm not on the warpath for them anymore." He said he would be here for a while. She stopped for a moment. Just before Buir left this last time, we were supposed to do some training. When I went to his quarters, I saw him packing. I got really upset. He'd promised me he'd stay. I ran, and when he caught up to me and tried to calm me down, I pushed out of his embrace and screamed at him. As soon as he'd mentioned the call, I had this horrible feeling. I flooded our bond with those feelings, and then I ran. If only I'd told him. Maybe he'd have stayed. She broke down crying then, her thin form shaking in Andrea's embrace. Andrea wrapped her arms around Marin before looking at her father. Stefan sat there rubbing his chin and thinking about it. "And you feel that you're somewhat responsible for his leaving anyway?" he asked. "That you didn't do enough to make him stay?" Marin nodded. "He'd promised. For a man to add, their word is their honor." She thought briefly of the letter Jared held in his fingers and felt her heart sink even more. "Not just for a Mandalorian, either," Stefan told her. "He would have held to that 3 times as strong, being a Katani and a Marine, as well as a Mandalorian. He had to have gone planning to come back." "He did," Jared said as he sat on the arm of Marin's chair. "He planned to spend much more time with her here or at their home." Marin nodded, feeling her stomach twist itself into knots again. Nervously, she smoothed her tunic again, the movement of her arm revealing the delicately worked embroidery. Ethan glanced over and looked at her. "Is that what I think it is?" Slowly, Marin lifted her gaze to Ethan and nodded. "Alec, it is," she said softly, the fingers of her right hand still clutching Jerry's as tags. Ethan nodded at Stefan, who'd also noticed it. "There's no reason to blame yourself for what has happened," Andrea whispered, "and continually beating yourself up for it will not bring him back any more than hunting these people out of pure hatred." Marin nodded. She'd already had the same discussion with Jared. But, gods, it felt like her heart had been ripped in two. "It's not revenge I want. It's justice. They have to be stopped. How many people have they killed? How many families have been torn apart? It must end." "And it will," Andrea told her. Whoa. Whoa. What just happened? Oh my goodness. Whoa. My goodness. Thank you for the subs and the hype train that apparently just started. Oh my goodness. I need to turn those sounds up because they're not very loud. Wow. Thank you, Ajao. And Valorant apparently tacked on a few more. Okay. Oh my goodness. Thank you. Yes. Yes, you indeed. You have stuck again. Thank you so much for those gifted subs. I appreciate you. Bears Den Gaming, Obi-Wan Jacoby, Stitch Doll, Alesta Din, Twisted Redneck, and a couple of other people. Let's see. Denros 217. All kinds of people. My goodness. Thank you very much. I appreciate you. Thank Thank you for that follow.
The Alice Corpse is now following.
Welcome to the stream. I totally lost where I was. Welcome into the stream. For anybody that is new to the stream, my name is Meshla. I am primarily an audiobook streamer. I write and read my own Star Wars fanfiction and have been doing so for 25 years. And now I'm sharing it on Twitch. I also play Star Wars The Old Republic occasionally. Tonight I'm reading because it's Christmas. I wanted to do something cozy. The story itself might not be cozy at the moment, but yeah, story time. For anybody who got a gifted sub, please thank your gifter. We're currently in a level 2 hype train. Oh my goodness, that doesn't happen very often at all over here, so that is very much appreciated. And welcome in. I hope you're enjoying the stream. I'm gonna try and figure out where the heck I was because I completely lost track of where I was. Oh my goodness. Oh. Okay. Oh my goodness. Wait, we got raided? What? Oh my goodness, you guys. No, Angel gifted 5 subs and then Valorant tagged one on. No, if it was a raid, it should have popped off with a whole bunch of different... It should have popped off with the Imperial Siren. No, you're fine. I was really confused for a second there, too. It's totally okay. It's fine. We have an ad starting in 4 minutes and 10 seconds. Unfortunately, I don't have a way to turn those off. So I would appreciate it if you guys could hang out and through those. And... Alright. Oh goodness. Yeah, I completely lost track of where I was. Sorry. Oh man. Okay. Yes. Yes, go conquer those ads. Oh my. You guys. Level 2 at 83%. Thank you so much for all those gifted subs and bits. You guys are amazing. So appreciate you. Yeah. I usually don't get hype trains, so that's kind of cool. I'm still working on alerts and stuff, so I apologize for the scuff. So I'm working on it. But thank you, Ajo, for your generosity, sir. I appreciate you. There we go. Okay. And it will, Andrea told her. Father, I will take her downstairs if it's okay. Some remote work may help her unwind with my instruction. Agreed, Stefan said as he nodded. I think maybe adding something else into the mix would help. Grab Sovereign's lightsaber from the display as you go. Marin's eyes widened as she watched Andrea open the display and pick up one of the lightsabers from within. She'd seen the display case before, but why was he letting her use one, much less a full-powered one? She looked across to Master Card with an expression of confused curiosity. Yes, choo-choo indeed. Thank you, guys. Andrew will explain, Stefan said as he gestured for her to follow after his daughter. Marin chewed on her lower lip nervously for a moment before she rose and bowed politely, giving Jared a final glance before she slipped out of the room and slid the door shut behind her. It'll be all right, Andrea said as she walked towards the kitchen. We're going downstairs for a little while, Mother. We'll be just fine, Jade said as she played with Ian on her lap. Andrea grinned and moved towards the fireplace, motioning for Marin to follow. Marin smiled slightly as she passed Lady Card in the kitchen and followed Andrea to the fireplace. She'd been in the room before. Andrea had said that they were going downstairs, but Marin didn't see a doorway. Andrea silently answered her curiosity by placing her hand on a particular stone on the fireplace mantel. A moment later, part of the paneling next to the fireplace started to slide back, revealing a staircase cut into the stonework beyond. Marin gasped and traded a look with Andrea before her gaze went to the staircase. The air coming from the stairwell was cool and a bit moist. I would never have known that was here, she breathed. After a moment of stunned silence, she stepped onto the staircase, letting her eyes adjust to the dimness beyond. Andrea led her carefully down the staircase. Lights, she finally called, and saw that the soft illumination in the cavern gradually brightened to the settings that had been programmed, revealing the layout of the area below. And I'm going to stop there because we have an ad starting. I'm actually going to take a 5-minute break if you guys don't mind. Give me 1 sec. I'm going to see if I can get music going. 1 sec. Alright. Sorry about that. Needed a snack. Thanks for your patience, guys. I appreciate it. Alright. Get myself a little bit of water. As the illumination came up, Marin gasped. What caught her attention was the pattern of stones inlaid on the floor. It was the master's wheel, but the design was more intricate. Seeing it brought back memories of the first time she'd seen the training circle at the Praxium. She had to bite her lip at the swell of sadness she felt. It was a few moments as she took some slow breaths, trying to calm herself. Marin? Andrea asked as she walked over to check on her. Marin looked up at Andrea's soft question. Nisita, she said softly. It brings back memories seeing the master's wheel. Good ones, but... She shrugged helplessly, unable to explain it. Reaching up, she tucked a few loose strands of hair behind her ear. This has been here for several hundred years, Andrea told her as she gestured to the pattern in the stones. Daddy began his training here, and so did Rinius and myself. A few other Jedi have worked and practiced here, too. Marin nodded. I can almost feel them. It's comforting in a way, she said after a moment. And then her gaze moved to the lightsaber in Andrea's hand. I noticed Master Card suggested you bring that Jetikad, but isn't that a full-powered blade? Andrea looked at the lightsaber in her hand and nodded. It is. I'm unsure why he asked me to allow you to start learning it, but I know this blade has a particular history. Maybe that's why he chose it. Marin looked at her curiously and knelt carefully on the edge of the master's wheel. What kind of history? Andrea moved to the center of the circle, igniting the pale blue blade, and held it still as she regarded it for a few moments. This was the lightsaber of a young student named Sovereign. I don't know his full name because he was killed before I was born. Just before my parents married, actually. She swung the blade around a bit before she held it again. Sovereign was my father's first Padawan. The color fascinated Marin, and as she watched the blade as it spun. What happened? She asked. She looked down for a moment, idly smoothing her tunic and trousers as she tried to settle her thoughts. The High Council assigned Daddy to investigate a series of pirate raids. They were starting to cause unrest in the neighboring star systems. As it turned out, it was supposed to be the beginnings of a coup d'etat of the local system set up by a senator from Sarafa. Andrea told her as she shut down the blade and sat on the floor next to Marin. Father discovered not only this, but also that 2 Sith Lords were behind it. One was hiding among the High Council. The other had been a close friend of my father's when he was a Jedi student. Marin frowned. A close friend of Master Card's who'd become a Sith? And a Sith hidden on the council? She gestured for Andrea to continue. Well, his friend confronted him while he and Sovereign were separated. Sovereign was waiting at the ship while Stefan went out. Welt, that was his name, fought and disabled my father in the streets of the city. Then he went and ambushed Sovereign and killed him. Marin gasped. It sounded almost like what had happened to her father. It is, Andrea told her, sensing the thought. Welt had set it up as an ambush for both of them. He had also captured Mother and temporarily severed the connection through the Force that she and my father share. Daddy confronted him here on Catan, in the same clearing where you and the others did your hunt, and defeated him. Marin's eyes widened. She'd felt something then, but couldn't put her finger on it at the time. It made sense now. I did feel something during the hunt, but it was elusive. From what Father told me, it was a long fight between them. It was the first Sith he'd ever had to fight against, and it just happened to be one he had considered his best friend. That made Marin cringe in sympathy. She could have hurt Jared the other day. Just the thought of that stilled her for a moment. I sort of know how he must have felt then, she said, tracing the embroidery around the hem of her tunic after a moment. There may be another connection as to why he chose this lightsaber, Andrea said softly as she handed the hilt, pommel first, to Marin. This is the first time this lightsaber has left his display case in almost 20 years. That brought Marin's head up in surprise. She tried to still her fidgeting by clasping her hands in her lap, but it was hard. 20 years? Andrea nodded and gestured towards the hilt. Marin gazed down at it, noting the simple angular lines. It was functional, but she also noted that the parts fit together very well, almost seamlessly. Go ahead and familiarize yourself with it, Andrea told her, but be careful. Sovereign didn't put any controls in place to adjust the blade's intensity. Marin looked up at Andrea for a moment before she carefully took the hilt from Andrea's hand. She stood and backed up a few steps, carefully holding the hilt's emitter away from her as she thumbed the activation plate. The blue blade appeared again. The snap hiss and the thrum of the blade were deeper. She could almost feel the vibrations through her fingers. She stared at the blade itself for a moment, noting that its color was close to the color of the tunics that Jarius was fond of wearing. After a few moments, she moved carefully into the first position of Form 4, noting how the blade handled a bit differently than her training blade. It feels like it's heavier and has more air resistance. It will for a while, Andrea told her. I had noticed it myself when I built my lightsaber and started using it. I can't explain why, but after a while it'll feel as light as if using your boken. Later, it'll feel even lighter. Later? Marin raised an eyebrow. If he wants me to keep this one. She couldn't possibly. She'd gotten the sense that Master Card held the blade in great respect. I'm speaking in general terms, Marin, Andrea said gently. I don't know what he's planning with this blade, whether it is for you for the moment or from now on. That is entirely up to him. And you. I want you to start going through the katas I've shown you. This time, though, I want you to start focusing not just on your environment, as we have done in the field, but focusing through the lightsaber. Feel it and use it as an extension of yourself, if you can. Marin flushed slightly and nodded as she began to slow her breathing, trying to settle her thoughts. Her breathing slowed, but she couldn't stop thinking about Jarius. She sighed and spread her feet slightly, her eyes drifting closed. It took her a moment or two, but she remembered the focusing exercise that Dylan had taught them on her first day. She used the same technique here. It could have been her imagination, but she felt the hilt warm slightly in her hands as she slowly moved from the first to the second position. It was a little clumsy at first, but slowly she began to feel more confident. Good night, Rafe. Have a good night at work. Give me one sec. Good night. Try not to fight channeling through the saber, Andrea told her as she kept her senses locked on Marin and the lightsaber. Let it come naturally. Marin breathed out, trying to release her frustration. It was more challenging for her to connect with the Jeti Cod than her connection with the Boken had been. Why is it so hard for me to connect? Even with my training saber, I'd felt the disconnect, she thought. She sighed, focusing on the weight of the hilt in her fingers, the smoothness of the metal. And then she thought of something. Maybe if I treat it like one of my knives. She had a good connection with those because she used them all the time and had spent time making them her own. A faint frown creased her forehead as that thought brought up thoughts of Jarius. She thought of the time he'd spent training her. It still brought silent tears to her eyes when she thought of him, and they slid down her cheeks as she tried to hold on to the feeling she had with her knives. Her fingers flexed a bit around the lightsaber's hilt before they settled. She breathed out, picturing herself in her mind, first with her knives and then her training saber. That helped a little. Andrea could sense her difficulty and watched closely as Marin performed the kata. She closed her eyes for a moment, sending a question to her father through the force, and then opened them again to continue watching Marin work through the movements of the kata. Slowly, Marin began the kata again. It still felt strange. With a sigh, she shifted her grip slightly and reached out more with her senses as she had in the forest. She'd been staying relatively closed down since Jarius. She bit down on that thought as tears threatened again and reached out, hesitant as she let her awareness flow down her arms and into her hands, wrapping around the hilt slowly. It was a strange feeling. Andrea started to sense it and nodded. Marin breathed out again and felt a tiny bit of the tension float away as she moved to the next position. In her mind, she saw the deserted street again as the Kirtsad began to materialize. Slowly, she began to move, seeing them come at her one by one, some with blasters, others with pescade. She felt a faint pulse in her mind and then ripples as if something had started moving. Andrea glanced over at the control panel she had activated and adjusted the timer and the number of remotes activated for the trial. That done, she turned back to Marin and quietly said to her, "There are 3 blaster remotes on a timer. Overlay your thoughts of the Death Watch members on them, but use caution. I will terminate this test if you start acting out of anger and hatred." Marin nodded and dropped into a low stance. Half kneeling on the stones of the master's wheel, she closed her eyes. "Alec," she replied. There were the ripples again. In her mind, she saw the street, the buildings off to the edge of her vision, crumbling from age and damage. Looking down the street, she saw 2 appear out of nothingness, one with a blaster and the other with a pescade. She flexed her fingers around the hilt, breathing out to calm herself as she rose to a crouch. The one on the left came in, sweeping his blade down towards her neck. She rolled sideways, sweeping her leg out to catch him behind the knees. He stumbled, and she rolled clear, her saber sweeping around to block a bolt from the other who had aimed for her back. "Keep your motions smooth and fluid," Andrea told her as she stood and watched the test play out, "just as I showed you." Marin nodded silently, reaching out again as she felt the faint ripples. The one with the pescade came around again, sweeping his blade from the right. Marin pulled her arm back, sweeping the lightsaber down to block as she struck out with a left roundhouse to his ribs. He stumbled backwards a few steps, holding his side. The other came in again, sweeping his whip around to follow her movement, squeezing off a few shots as he did so. She felt the faint tingle at the base of her neck. In the next instant, she swept her blade behind her, blocking 2 bolts before she switched the blade to her left hand. With her right, she reached out and flicked her fingers away from her, sending the one wielding the pescade skidding into the building off to her right. She saw him hit the wall and lay there stunned. The one wielding a blaster popped off another few shots, varying his targets. The blade came up in her left hand, blocking the shot that would have hit her arm, and then down to block the one to her knee, but she missed one. She felt a sting as one of the bolts tagged her in the shoulder, and she stumbled. "Hold," Andrea called, noting that the system controlling the remotes froze them in midair instantly. "These are a low power, but they can still surprise you the first time they hit. Are you okay?" "I think so. It stings a little, though." Marin tried to remember some of what Callista had taught her about controlling the pain as she rubbed her shoulder briefly. "Are you well enough to continue?" Marin nodded. "Yes," she said firmly, standing and stretching before she settled into a ready stance. Andrea nodded and considered adding an extra remote, but decided against it as she walked along the edge of the training circle. "Resume." Marin felt the ripples again. In her mind, she saw the one with the blaster slap a fresh power pack into place. He ducked behind one of the abandoned speeders, using it as cover as he took shots at her again. She breathed out in frustration, creeping forward slowly with the saber held ready. Andrea continued to watch Marin's every move with the lightsaber. Her form wasn't as fluid as it had been previous times, but the Jedi took what had happened over the last few days into account and saw that she didn't let the wave of anger that had fallen over her the night before affect her actions now as she deflected every bolt that was fired at her after recovering from the one hit she took. It was several minutes before she heard the chime from the panel and the remotes started to fly back into their alcoves. Excellent, Andrea told her as she walked closer. You were able to keep it under control the entire time. Marin nodded. She had been able to, yes, but it had been hard. She lifted her left hand to her forehead and wiped away the light sheen of sweat that she found there. Granted, I could tell it was difficult. I think you'll gradually be able to better control it. She smiled and she motioned to the lightsaber. Eventually, you'll be able to shed it completely. Marin nodded and sighed. Seeing that deserted street made her want to cry. She took a slow breath and breathed out once more, reciting the remembrance under her breath. Did you start to feel what I was telling you? Andrea asked. Did you start to feel the lightsaber as part of you? I did. A little. I felt it before with my bokken and a little bit with the training blade, but I felt it a lot more with my knives. So I took the feeling I got when working with my knives and tried to get the same here. Not sure how well it worked, though. She nervously rubbed the back of her neck for a moment before she looked up at Andrea. The older Jedi nodded and thought about this for a moment. Your knives, something you fashioned yourself with your father's help? Marin nodded. He'd helped me make a new set before he... She stopped, feeling tears threaten again. Curling her fingers around the hilt in her finger, she tried not to cry. Nisita, she said softly as she looked down at the floor, trying to control her emotions. Strength, Marin, Andrea said as she moved forward and placed a hand on Marin's shoulder, sending ripples of comfort through the force. Don't dwell on the passing. Let it flow out and through you. Hold on to the good memories. He hasn't left you fully. As long as you keep those memories, he still lives in you. Marin squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, whispering the remembrance again as she thought of all the time she spent with Jarius. Ne stukoi gar kiradish ne partaili gar darsum. Andrea closed her eyes and focused more, channeling her support to Marin, and did what she could to suppress the darkness that wanted to claw its way out. A few tears slid down Marin's cheek as she stood there. Yes, the sadness was there, but she was determined to help bring those Hotonla Kirtsa to justice. Beware deserved that much. It was a few moments before she sighed heavily and brushed her hand across her cheeks. I'll be all right, I think, she told Andrea quietly. Andrea smiled and touched some of Marin's hair behind her ear. Yes, you will, she said quietly. I see that you certainly will. Marin smiled, probably only her second time that day. There was still an ache in her heart, but it had lessened some. After a moment's thought, she reached over and slipped her fingers into Andrea's. Foray for bringing me down here. We both needed it, Andrea told her. I think my father has been talking with the council on something in particular. He's been telling me about it and asked my opinion. I wanted to get yours before he says something about it. Marin raised an eyebrow. And what would that be? He knows you have two paths to choose from since you're just as talented, if not a little more so, as any other student. Tradition usually is that at a certain point the student can be apprenticed to an older knight or master to learn more closely from. Marin bit her lip. She hadn't expected that, especially given the last few days. She frowned. Part of her wanted to follow the Mandawad path, but another part wanted to honor her promise to Master Card. With a sigh, she knelt once more on the stones of the master's wheel and gently pulled Andrea with her. She fidgeted slightly. I don't know. Part of me wants to follow the Mandawad path, but I also want to honor my promise to your Brewer and mine. I told Master Card I would stay as long as he felt I needed to. That's precisely the point, Andrea told her. He's not asking you to apprentice to him, Marin. Marin frowned. He's letting me choose who I want to apprentice to? Or what path? Ethan has agreed to continue your Mando training. For your Jedi training, he's asked me to be your master, if you'll accept. Marin's eyes widened in surprise. She thought about it. What if I wanted to do both? Father knows as well as I do that you might consider that, Andrea said. And if you choose both, I will teach you all that I can while you are here. Marin grinned. I'd like that very much. Would allowances be made for training missions with Ethan? I will make them if you want to accept this. Marin smiled and surprised herself as she threw her arms around Andrea. I accept! Andrea laughed as she hugged Marin close. She couldn't help but think that she had probably been like this herself once. All right, she said as she stood up. Father will be ready to see us upstairs in a little while. Marin looked upward briefly. They're still talking, aren't they? After a moment, she reached down and smoothed her tunic and pants. She found the color soothing as it reminded her of her father. They are. We'll give them a little more time. Stefan pulled up the holocom and punched in the channel he wanted. It took a moment or two, but Admiral Mather Payne's image appeared over his desk a moment later. I'm not even sure I want to know all about the hornet's nest you stirred up, MasterCard, he said with a slight smile. What are you talking about? Stefan asked. First, I hear about a massive explosion in 7th Battle Group's area. Then I see a chase with a YT-1930 that's been frequenting your area, followed by a D5 Mantis and an X-Wing registered to Her Highness. Seeing said Mantis fire pretty close to the 1930 and all three leaving the system before returning a while later and landing on your pad. And then you see a flight leave here to that system and come back a while later, Stefan finished. And then I hear news of a massive firefight in the area of the explosion, the Admiral continued, followed by a request from Captain Nagala to send whatever support cruisers I have that aren't being refitted to help him secure the system. Stefan looked at Ethan and Jared before continuing. I was going to ask what the status of that was. He's had CSS Arcane and her group and what support I could send effectively covering the system. Nothing's getting off or getting to that planet without us knowing about it. Ethan nodded. That's good to hear, Admiral. We had a hard enough time getting in there ourselves. As to the YT-1930, that was a personal matter. He looked at Stefan, wondering if he'd told the Admiral. Ethan was fearless in telling the Admiral if he asked. Funny, the Admiral said as he looked over them. That's exactly what Master Card told me. I had my best squadron of fighters readying to deploy before he called. Ethan glanced over at Card again. Should I tell him, Card? He asked quietly. I'd just as soon not know, Payne said, holding up his hand. We've been called in to assist the Jedi often without questions. They can be left unasked this time as well. As I said, we've gotten additional word that a massive firefight was on the surface. I take it you and your company were part of it? Ethan cleared his throat and nodded. Since you know about that, I might as well tell you. You remember Jerry Esturza? He asked carefully, watching the Admiral's expression. Trust me, sir. Trust me, sir. What I'm about to tell you will explain quite a bit. I heard about what happened with the family years ago, Payne said. We were coordinating with his unit when we got the word about it. Ethan nodded once more. He's been tracking Deathwatch the last few years, a standing order from the Mandalore. From what Card tells me, 3 days ago, he received a call from someone claiming to be able to show Durza where the Deathwatch were hiding. The coordinates he was given were to that planet you have now blockaded. Ethan paused and took a breath. From what we were able to discover, he was lured into a trap by the Deathwatch. There was an area on that planet of about a 2-block radius that was utterly destroyed. Beradium, we think. Jarius was killed in the blast. We recovered but a few pieces of his armor, and only then because his daughter knew their shape. As to the chase with the 1930, that was his ship, the Tricinia. It had returned to Catan using his daughter's comlink as a beacon. She took control of the vessel and was trying to make for home. He turned to Card to finish the rest, as he was never good with the emotional stuff. Marin's taken his death hard, Card told the Admiral. Real hard. He was all she had. Then I fully understand the situation, Payne said as he looked off-screen for a moment. I'm actually preparing to send the rest of my battle group out now. I may send a few more ships that way. Ethan nodded. A good idea. We don't know how many of the Deathwatch were still on the planet when we pulled out last night, or what equipment they have. It does concern me, though, that they were so close to Catan. I'm going to stop there because we have an ad starting. Okay. Dan, it's good to see you. Welcome in. Well, I'll be going a little bit over time tonight. I was going to try to get to chapter 30, but chapter 26 was really long. Okay, our ad is going to end in 1 minute and 17 seconds. Take the opportunity to get a drink of water, take a stretch, have a snack, all that fun stuff. I try not to read during the ad breaks, just in case there's people in the stream that do not have a subscription. So. Okay. So I know I said I was going to read to chapter 30, but I would have to see how long those are. Because it's after 10 already, and we're not done with chapter 28 yet. So, what do you guys think? We could be here for another hour. I don't know. I'm gonna actually see how long they are. Oh, that's not long. We are back from our ad. What do you guys think? I could stop at the end of 28. I could read through 29. 30 is kind of a bit long, but not like super long. So, it's up to you guys. Okay. Alright. You think it has you concerned? Payne asked him. Mando, if or when the High Command learns that Death Watch was operating in Katani space, your enemies will be lucky if we don't bring all 7 battle groups down on them. Ethan grinned at him, and it was slightly predatory. When you do, I have a contingent from Mandalore as well as a few Jetize, this with a glance at Card, that have volunteered to help in whatever the Katani military requires in that regard. Stefan looked at Ethan, saw the grin, and then looked to the Admiral. Keep me in the loop, Admiral. You have my direct comm frequency. Aye, Master Jedi, Payne said as his image faded. Interesting, Stefan said. All 7 groups. Ethan raised his eyebrows in appreciation. I wasn't expecting that either. Especially if you know how many ships that is, Stefan said as he looked over at Jared. Your thoughts? Jared had been silent during the exchange, but now he sat forward with his hands on his knees as he thought about it. What has me concerned, Sensei, is that from all accounts it looks like Jerry's was traced here as if they've been watching and waiting for an opportunity. Which means they may have been watching over the entire Praxium, Stefan said. If they were able to get this close, he shook his head, they really will want to bring all 7 groups down on their heads. Jared frowned. Is there anything the Praxium can do to help? He grew silent a moment, feeling a faint pulse from Marin from downstairs. I know Marin is determined to bring them to justice, and not just for her father's sake either. There are only a few students I would consider close to being ready to handle a task like this, Stefan said as he sat down. You are certainly among them. Bran, Koya, and Tara would be as well. Maybe a few of the others, but not many. Certainly not the Corellians that Senator Sybil asked me to begin training here. That got Jared's attention. Why not, Master? Stefan looked at him. You know as well as I do that they only recently started their training. Corellians are not ready. I see your point, Sensei. Jared bowed his head a moment in apology. I guess my next question would be, what can those of us who are ready do to help? I know Marin will want to help, and I think it's better if she does. The more of her friends who are there to support her will help greatly. And they shall, Stefan told him. I've also thought of some additional measures to help her out while dealing with this. Your support is invaluable, Jared, and I thank you for it. She'll need another kind now. Jared nodded. How exactly do you mean, Master? A moment after his question, the doors to his study opened, and Stefan looked to see Andrea standing there with Marin. And? He asked. She did well, Andrea told him. And she's accepted the invitation to become my Padawan. Very good, Stefan said as he stood. Wait just a... Ethan started to say as he stood as well. You said that I could continue to train her. You both will, Stefan said, closing the distance and looking at Ethan with a knowing and encouraging smile. Marin will be allowed to go on missions with you. Andrea has accepted that point. I see, Ethan said as he nodded to Stefan's daughter. I apologize, then, Highness. Andrea smiled warmly. Coming from a Mandalorian, I know that means a lot, she said as she looked at Marin. And you fully understand that all your training will be with her now? Stefan asked Marin. Marin nodded. There was a brief flash of disappointment at not having any more lessons with Master Card, but her excitement outweighed it quickly. I do, Master Card, she said, after a glance at Ethan. Stefan looked down at his former Padawan's lightsaber in her hand. How does it feel in your grip? Marin flushed. I'm still getting used to it, but it's not as strange as I thought it would be. She looked up at Andrea with a smile, remembering how she'd related it to her knives. For now, continue using it for your training. You can start constructing your own when Andrea feels you are ready. Marin gasped, her eyes huge. She knew what that lightsaber meant to him. After a moment, she bowed. I am honored, Sensei. He nodded and then looked to Jared and Ethan before looking at the chronometer on the wall. The last few days' events have been tiring for us all. Let's get some rest and wait for Zan and Callista to return before we reconvene. And that is the end of chapter 28. I was originally going to go to chapter 30 tonight, but, what do you guys think? Should I stop now? Actually, that might be a really good place to stop. Cause stuff gets interesting after that. So yeah, I was planning to go to chapter 30 tonight, but, it's after 10. And I should probably sleep. At least some. So, I think I'm going to edit it. Oh, it didn't even... Goodness. Never updated my... Ugh, I never updated my stream title. Goodness. Yeah, I never updated my stream title. I did fix it. Goodness, like it really didn't. Okay. Anyway, thank you for everybody who was here this evening. I am actually going to go ahead and call it here because it's after 10 and I should probably get some rest. Let's see. And yeah, I was pretty sure that I had updated it before I went live and it like reverted for whatever reason. I don't know what's going on. Stream is being very scuffed today, so yeah. Fun times. But anyway, thank you for each and every one of you who was here this evening. I hope you appreciated the story, and I hope you have an awesome rest of your evening for Christmas, and a good day tomorrow. Please be safe, and I hope to see you all the next stream, which is going to be Sunday, 7 p.m. Eastern. I will be working on the some more chapters, so hope to see you then. Have a great evening. Thanks, guys.